The action takes place in a mountainous area on the eve of a decisive battle. The elder of the sinister cult was in the halls of his castle. Looking at the flames outside the walls, he saw a multitude of guests who had arrived, waiting for the gates to be opened and allowed to enter. At this moment, the leader of the sect named Steadfast Sword spoke. He reminded the demonic brotherhood that after many years they had finally cornered him. Now, not only the 9 powerful clans they once despised, but also countless other sects had united as one. They came with one goal: to make the demonic cult pay for its arrogant behavior. They were no longer willing to endure until their opponents finally opened the gates to them. Outside the gates stood a young man, the incarnation of the heavenly demon, as well as the future head of the demonic brotherhood. This young man's name was Gushan, and he clearly did not feel the slightest fear, although he knew perfectly well how many people had come for his life. The righteous warrior only became angry at Gucheon's attitude, promising to put an end to all the evil deeds that the young man had committed. The only thing that made the guy furious was that the aliens made such a noise in the middle of the night, which made him extremely angry. The youth seemed to have gone mad, so he warned the elders that today they would all die by his hand. The head of the sect realized that this boy was more than arrogant. However, the oppressive Gucheon ordered the old man to finally shut up and come closer to him. The leader immediately drew his blade and sent his men to crush the lair that was the demonic cult. At the same moment, Gucheon also controlled his subordinates, and he ordered armed warriors to destroy all the fools who, not knowing their place, dared to come here. The youth also entered the battle with them, cutting down his opponents. However, the enemies were not afraid and continued to advance, knowing that they had a powerful ally on their side. But until this ally came to the rescue, the reckless little people died one after another. Some were so frightened that they even tried to run away, realizing that they had angered the great demon. No one told them how terrible Gucheon was, but the young man did not allow them to escape. Instead, he chopped their bodies into pieces. It even angered him that someone like the head of the sect believed that he could kill him with such pitiful power. What did they expect? He took it as a personal insult. Looking at the strength of this boy, the warrior realized that if such a child were ever brought into the Jonam clan, they too could turn into a demonic brotherhood. He couldn't help but admit that this person was the true incarnation of the heavenly demon, so he had no choice. He turned to their secret weapon, promising to fulfill his promise in exchange for bringing him Gucheon's head. And then, drawing his blade, the warrior found himself right in front of the demon's reincarnation. Without answering any questions, he immediately rushed forward with his sword at the ready, aiming at Gucheon's body. He easily fought off this attack, armed with his blade. However, he was amazed. He did not know that among such righteous people there was someone so strong. He wanted to know where this degenerate came from, whether he was a member of the Shaolin clan or Chonam himself. However, the enemy, hiding his face under a mask, did not give him an answer to his questions, thereby making the enemy even more indignant. The reincarnation of the heavenly demon. These children had no manners at all. They grow up not answering their elders when they are asked questions. He even warned the impudent fellow that if he had accidentally ended up in the demonic brotherhood, he would have been beaten half to death long ago for such terrible manners. After these words, he attacked his enemy again and seemed to hit the target. But as soon as the wind cleared the dust after the blow, it turned out that the enemy had managed to dodge in time. He acknowledged that Gucheon's abilities were truly impressive, and the young man could not help but be disappointed that the enemy only now realized his superiority. When the enemy announced to Gucheon that he would die today, the young man only laughed. After all, someone like this uninvited guest could not compare to him in strength. However, he suddenly realized why his body was starting to weaken. Only then did he realize that there was a huge wound gaping in his body. What amazed him most was that he didn't even notice when his opponent struck him. After this, his body could no longer bear it, and he gradually began to cough up blood. But even so, he was furious at the degenerate who had wounded him and then dared to make fun of him. The man himself, hiding his face under the mask, was surprised that the reincarnation of the heavenly demon, despite serious injuries, was still alive and could even speak. Then the hero just screamed angrily about how much he had done to reach his level. None of the degenerates who came for his soul could imagine how difficult his path had been. However, at that moment he fell silent, hearing the cries of his assistants addressed to the head of the cult. He immediately turned away from the enemy to see what was happening to their leader. However, all he noticed was the last moment of the old man's life, before his head was cut off from his body. And then the enraged Gucheon furiously shouted that these bastards would definitely pay for what they did. But he didn't have time to do anything. At that very moment, his head was already mercilessly cut off. As he died, he looked at the fallen leader of the sect and could not believe in such a tragic outcome. At that fateful moment, his whole life began to flash before his fading gaze. He saw himself as a little boy, training until he was completely exhausted. And then he saw himself older, alone and despised by everyone, sitting on a deserted hill. It was then that he met his mentor. and also the future head of the demonic brotherhood. For this reason, Gucheon was in unbearable pain and distress. He could not come to terms with the fact that he died without protecting anyone. However, he soon discerned some kind of ghostly silhouette in front of his clouded eyes, and also heard a strange, disturbing noise. At that moment, some guy unknown to Gucheon, wearing someone else's clothes, swung his hand to strike, after which a painful slap landed across the young man's face. His eyes widened in shock as he saw 3 insolent guys standing over him, clearly mocking him. The leader ordered this poor guy to stop lying around in a faint, because he just wanted to move on to the most exciting part of the game, to beat him up as many times as possible. Gucheon just blinked in confusion, not understanding what kind of bastards were looming in front of him. In that mystical moment, the world around him seemed to freeze for a second. He saw a translucent scroll in front of him, congratulating him on receiving a new deadly mission to clean up the trash. He had only 30 seconds left to complete the task, and if he failed to complete it within this critical time, he would simply die. In this tense moment, before he had time to come to his senses, the leader placed him opposite himself for a more powerful blow. After which he raised his fist, ordering the guy to clench his teeth tighter so as not to lose them. But the enraged Gucheon, who had absolutely no idea who these pathetic degenerates were, kicked the impudent fellow right in the face with all his might, after which he ordered the guy to stop annoying him, otherwise they would pay for it in the near future. Everyone in the class heard a loud, ominous crash as their classmate fell heavily to the floor, after which they saw Gucheon's changed gaze, which was filled with some kind of wild, primitive determination. The young man himself at that moment stared intently at the mysterious scroll that appeared before his face, not understanding the nature of this phenomenon. At some point he even thought that he had completely gone crazy. However, one terrifying phrase caught his attention. Failure of the mission meant certain death. What nonsense, considering that he's already dead. But suddenly he felt a piercing pain in his heart. Such a sharp pain the dead cannot feel. He even thought that he might actually be alive. The system quickly explained to him that he was possessed. The frightened Gucheon began to feverishly consider which of his opponents might be capable of the possession technique, and decided that it was the scum from the blood cult. It remained a mystery why they would do something like that. However, at this fateful moment, the system offered the guy to complete the first and final mission. As a reward, he will be able to choose any moment in his life and return to his original body. Gucheon's eyes widened in amazement at what he saw. He couldn't believe that he actually had another precious chance to live his life again. At this critical moment, he had 23 seconds left to complete the garbage collection mission. Then, having calmed down and looking back at the guys who had surrounded him in a tight ring, he realized that this world was not an illusion at all. He felt severe pain in his body and saw unfamiliar people in an unfamiliar place. All this served as irrefutable proof that this damn scroll before his eyes was not lying. And although he didn't know what exactly this mysterious scroll had done to his body, he decided to play along with it. For this reason, he called the 3 impudent fellows closer in order to talk to them. The first of them immediately rushed furiously at Gucheon, swinging at the face of such an emboldened loser. Gucheon stared blankly at his slow fist, not believing that he was actually attacking so pathetically. After which he struck him with his fist with lightning speed, so that his opponent flew back, crashing into the classroom wall with a crash. Then his fat friend tried to attack, trying to crush the guy with the weight of his body. Easily dodging this primitive attack, Gucheon realized how much idiots like this guy irritated him. He couldn't believe that they had the audacity to think they could defeat him. So I decided to show that I was ready to kill any such bastard with my own hands if they finally stopped being such hopeless idiots. Having already dealt with 3 of the 4 opponents, Gucheon was left with one last pathetic guy to complete his deadly mission. However, to his great surprise, he suddenly disappeared from the place where he had just stood. So Gucheon immediately turned to the children sitting at their desks to find out where this insolent coward had run off to. They only frightenedly pointed in the direction where their classmate had just run away. At first, the hero just rubbed his head indifferently, not wanting to pursue this pathetic ragamuffin. However, he suddenly realized that he had to teach this scoundrel a harsh lesson, otherwise he would inevitably meet his end. At this critical moment, the timer was already rushing towards the fateful 5 seconds. The escapee was already running down the stairs, considering Gucheon a complete idiot who would pay for his pride as soon as their formidable leader found out about it. But Gucheon caught up with him with his merciless retribution, and exactly at the last second he dealt him what seemed at first glance to be a fatal blow. The guy's body crashed into the nearest wall with such monstrous force that it fell apart into tiny pieces, and Gucheon calmly exhaled with deep relief, glad that he managed to complete the task a second before failure. Finally, the deadly mission was completed, and at that moment a girl, also descending the stairs, ran up to him. She looked at her classmate with embarrassment, trying to understand whether they had managed to harm him. After which she looked at the broken wall and the boy behind it, who was making fun of her friend in every possible way. And also, since they met, she decided to discuss why her friend had recently decided to avoid her. And she even considered that perhaps because of puberty, he thinks that it is not convenient for him to hang out with girls. Gu Cheon didn't know what to answer. He just scratched his hand, thereby involuntarily revealing the bloody wound on it. So the girl immediately grabbed him to check how serious the bruise was. Apparently, Gu Cheon wanted to calm her down by letting her know that he had beaten that guy and injured his hand. However, the girl, almost crying, believed that it was these vile scoundrels who inflicted this injury on the poor boy. So she immediately grabbed a handful of stones from the destroyed wall and started throwing them at this pathetic freak. And he, with his last strength, having regained consciousness, tried to moan and explain that he had not managed to do anything at all. Only when the enraged girl finally ran out of stones did she realize that there was no point in figuring things out any further. So she turned to her friend, only slightly embarrassed, thinking about how she could help him. Nothing better came to her mind than to take the boy to the nurse's office. Apparently, Gu Cheon tried to argue, thinking that he definitely didn't need a nurse. However, the girl did not listen to him, and, as usual, did it her own way. After carefully bandaging the boy's hands and face, she left him in the office so that he could rest a little. And of course, she asked him to call her immediately in case any of his ill-wishers decided to bother him. Gu Cheon was as obedient as possible, even nodding, until the caring girl finally left, leaving him alone. Only after that was he able to sit down and think about what had just happened to him. Moreover, he was especially surprised by his own body. He placed 2 fingers on the vein and tried to check the state of his internal energy. However, his meridians were blocked every 5 centimeters, not allowing energy to pass through properly. And soon, from using his martial arts, Gu Cheon felt a strong recoil in the form of pain throughout his entire body. And of course, he began to vomit blood due to the overload of his entire body. The guy was amazed that his new body couldn't cope even with such primitive techniques. This made him feel righteously angry, considering that he was Gu Cheon himself from the great demon cult. For some reason, painful memories from all the times when he was still Gu Cheon, the reincarnation of the heavenly demon, suddenly appeared in his head. Then he went out to his teacher, who at that time was standing on the balcony, admiring the views from there. Gu Cheon approached and wanted to know why the man decided to call him, and he only calmly reminded the student about the man they had recently caught. From his memories, Gu Cheon immediately realized that they were talking about that strange guy. The cult leader was worried that this guy kept saying some weird things. He kept saying that he didn't come from these parts. Apparently, Gu Cheon thought that perhaps he came from some other sect, although visually he looked like some kind of hermit. But it turns out that wasn't the point. This strange guy claimed that he came here from another world. Apparently, Gu Cheon only laughed loudly at what he heard, considering this boy to be simply crazy. But the cult leader was concerned that this might not be madness or a joke at all, so he decided to think about it in his spare time. But soon after that, they were attacked by enemies. But now, sitting and thinking, Gu Cheon realized that he shouldn't have laughed at that guy. It would have been much better to question him. But after that, he switched to thoughts about his new body. It was so unusual that even the smallest amount of energy could not fit into it. The hero was amazed by what was happening to him now, and would very much like to discuss it with his teacher. He found himself in a world that was completely different from the world they once lived in. After which he finished his little meditation, and the guy lay down to rest a little. And only then did he remember that that damned scroll promised to give him a reward for completing the task. So he shouted loudly into the air, demanding that this award be given to him as soon as possible. If suddenly this scroll decided to keep quiet and pretend that it had nothing to do with it, then it would take cruel revenge on him. But when the scroll didn't appear even after all these threats, Gu Cheon, no longer holding back, shouted, demanding that this thing stop hiding. Finally, the scroll responded to his call and appeared right before his eyes. He also congratulated him on completing the task and invited the guy to receive his reward. He hoped that this reward would be a return to his world, to the world where what he was supposed to protect and guard remained. However, suddenly some unknown wind rose around his body, and his whole body was illuminated with a golden light, because of which Gu Cheon believed that he had gained some new unknown power. He even began to excitedly read the inscriptions on the scroll, believing that he was about to go back. But as it turned out, his reward was that now this body would constantly emit a pleasant smell. The angry guy immediately tried to grab the scroll in order to punish him for such a shitty reward. But as soon as he tried to squeeze his hand around it, it immediately began to disappear, hiding from the guy. The obviously dissatisfied guy immediately started yelling, not understanding how this scroll dared to do this to him. But at that moment, a girl standing below called him and was clearly surprised by his behavior. She just scolded Gu Cheon in displeasure for being too noisy, preventing her from concentrating properly. She even thought that he decided to rent this place, so he behaved here as if it belonged only to him. However, looking at her classmate's uncomprehending face, the beauty thought that perhaps he was sick or had gone crazy, since he didn't understand what was being discussed. And in principle, Gucheon could not argue with the fact that this girl was partly right. The beauty had no choice but to take a drag on her cigarette, amazed at the behavior of this loser. Now, having spoken to him personally, she understood why he was a real outcast at this school. However, she got a shock when she turned around and saw that the guy had already frozen literally a step away from her face. He was clearly annoyed that everyone was calling him a loser. For this reason, when he approached the girl, he decided to ask her what this meant and why everyone called him that. But before the girl could explain anything, a bully suddenly burst onto the roof of the school. The last of the beaten boys brought his leader here to punish Gucheon for his disobedience. The leader immediately approached the guy, believing that he believed in himself too much and thought that he was no longer a loser. From the way he spoke, Gucheon quickly guessed that this big guy was the leader among these guys. But instead of answering his question, the guy immediately rewarded him with a couple of blows, which Gucheon blocked at the last second. However, even though the blow was weak, he experienced severe pain, perhaps because his body had not yet fully recovered. But the leader had no intention of retreating, continuing to rush at him with many powerful attacks. All of them were aimed at his opponent's weak points. It was obvious he wanted the guy to die today. At this time, the girl herself stood behind the hero and fearfully asked them not to come closer to her. However, the leader did not pay the slightest attention to her. The leader struck the young man's legs, causing him to slip and fly backwards. As a result, he crashed back into the beauty standing behind him, and the fragile net she was leaning on instantly broke. The girl fell down with a piercing scream. The hooligans were horrified. After all, they were on the 5th floor. It seemed to Gucheon that the girl would probably survive. At most, she would get a few fractures. But Gucheon's words were complete nonsense, since people usually die from falling from such a height. Suddenly, a scroll appeared before the guy's eyes. But this time it was not blue, but bright gold. It was an emergency quest in which he had to save a girl who had fallen because of him. Naturally, the guy was outraged. After all, he was not the reason for her fall, and now he would have to clean up someone else's problems. When the leader noticed that the guy had approached the very edge of the cliff, he considered him a real madman. The conviction was strengthened when he, as if nothing had happened, jumped from the 5th floor. In fact, he did this not to save his classmate, but simply hoping that this time the reward would be worthy. At the last moment, he managed to catch the young girl and landed softly on his strong legs. The girl immediately screamed, not believing in her salvation and the absence of injuries. Gucheon, looking at her face, realized that she was scared. However, since she was still talking, he concluded that she was alive and well. The villains remaining on the roof had no idea what to do next. The leader had no choice but to run away from here as quickly as possible. Of course, the comrades were surprised by such a cowardly act. However, he understood perfectly well that none of his friends would want to clean up the mess that they had just made together. Therefore, he warned that according to legend, they had never been here and could not have been. Soon the leader froze in horror, seeing a familiar silhouette right in front of him. The whole body was instantly gripped by an inexplicable internal fear. The hero himself, as if nothing had happened, decided to find out where this scoundrel intended to escape to. He bit his tongue in shock, not understanding how the guy ended up here, even though he had just been falling down. However, the young man did not explain himself. He only thanked this idiot for the fact that thanks to his prank he received a good reward. It turned out that as a reward for the emergency quest, he could use 1% of his previous strength for 10 seconds. It took 24 hours to recharge, but even those 10 seconds were enough to beat the guys half to death. After a while, everyone was kneeling before him, apologizing for their misdeeds. They also told Gucheon that in this world he was just an ordinary weakling. That's why he was called a complete loser and no one respected people like him. Before, everyone called him a weakling, a loser, a brat, a useless piece of trash. Now that Mr. Gucheon has gained power, no one would dare to say that about him. For some reason, Gucheon was infuriated that the boy called him sir. He even wanted to kill him instantly, but still decided to have mercy. Not out of kindness, he just had more important things to do. He began to realize that while his strength was still very low, with the use of the skill, he regained his former power. The hero was confident, because no living creature could imitate the power he possessed in his past life, so he was actually able to use his power and bring it back. He wondered what kind of entity had brought him here and given him such rewards. Soon he was back within the walls of the school. No matter how he looked around, this world was very strange. He was amazed that women walked around in such short, revealing clothes. He also looked at this guy's hairstyles. They all looked extremely unusual by his standards. Besides, no matter who he looked at, people started whispering behind his back. The hero could not understand what was wrong, not even realizing that the problem was that he was sitting on the shoulders of one of the gang leaders. Then one of the 6 explained to the master that everyone was whispering because he was riding on one of them. However, Gucheon clearly did not see this as a problem or a reason to gossip. It turned out that in his past life he always did this. It was an honor for everyone to give him a ride, so he thought that the other school children were just jealous. While he was thinking about this, he suddenly felt very hungry. Indeed, a lot had happened to him during that long day, and he still hadn't had a chance to eat. So he immediately ordered his sixes to go to the restaurant to properly fill their stomachs. The leader was very surprised, not understanding what restaurant they were talking about. But all four soon stopped at the school cafeteria. The hero, like a man possessed, continued to stuff his stomach, enjoying the delicious food. Even the guys sitting next to him were amazed at the appetite with which he wolfed down the food. In fact, it was very tasty food, which he seemed to have never eaten before. Other guys thought so too, but they usually preferred higher-calorie, unhealthy foods. Hearing this, Gucheon decided to take the tray from one of the guys. After all, he was not full at all. Of course, the guy was angry, but Gucheon didn't pay attention, already devouring the second tray of food. Suddenly, another boy looked into the dining room. He was clearly surprised to see the boys in the company of such worthless scum. To attract attention, he immediately threw aside the chair that was standing nearby, after which he shouted loudly, demanding that his comrades explain what they were doing here. At that moment, the gang leader awkwardly looked back at Sangu, trying to portray a calm smile. But deep down, he knew that he was finished. Sangu walked closer to the table, standing right above Gucheon, casting a shadow on him. But the hero calmly looked at the guy who approached, expressing his incomprehension with his whole appearance. Why did he come here? Sangu just laughed, realizing that the rumors were true. He was clearly disappointed that his boys were carrying such a freak around like a king. Everyone else also started to make fun of these complete idiots, after which they decided to give them a ride like King Sangu. After all, he was worthy of the title of a real ruler. After this, Sangu, as if nothing had happened, leaned over to the hero, ordering him to immediately go up to the roof of the school to sort out the misunderstanding. When Gucheon didn't even look up from the table, he just laughed at his timidity, like some kind of animal. Having asserted himself, the guy left, wanting to wait for Gucheon on the roof. The hero himself, as if nothing had happened, continued to finish his school lunch. However, before Sang could leave, he reminded him that even a dog should not be touched when it was eating. Apparently, Sangu was offended by these words, thinking that Gucheon did not understand the situation he was in at all. He warned that he didn't care about the school's rules and regulations. He could kill him here, in front of everyone. Of course, the hero couldn't help but be surprised by this guy's self-confidence. But Gucheon kept his emotions in an iron grip. With a mocking smile, he turned to the boys who had been his slaves for several hours. The congratulations concerned their long-awaited release from his terror. My gaze fell on Sanga. Here it was, a much more interesting toy. The agreement was fulfilled. On the school roof, group confronted group. Gucheon stood calmly, as if the upcoming fight was child's play for him. Sangu was infuriated by his opponent's self-confidence. He didn't even think to be afraid of him. When the former servants hid behind the hero's back, Sangu decided that they had finally lost their minds. The local slang was unfamiliar to Gucheon, so Sangu's attacks seemed like stupid chatter to him. While Sangu was getting mad at Gucheon's stupidity, his friends decided to warn the gentleman about the danger. Sangu's gang was no joke. These guys were strong and completely different from the usual bullies. Even the seniors helped them. Gucheon let out a calm breath, letting his friends know that he understood the gist of the warning. In fact, he agreed to the fight for another reason. He wanted to test his guesses. The idiots were nobodies, but if his understanding was correct, a new task should appear now. And indeed, a new mission to clean up the trash arose. The reward was a restorative herb, and failure meant death. Gucheon was delighted to see another scroll. Now he understood the mechanism. He figured out how to provoke the emergence of new tasks. All that remained was to acquire new slaves to replace the previous ones to fulfill all whims. Sangu's gang noticed the hero's malicious smile. It seemed as if everything around them had darkened. They were surprised when they turned around and saw Gucheon fearlessly walking towards them. The guy was considered either crazy or someone who had never heard of their power. One of the sixes came out first to deal with this brat. His brag was about training with a boxing champion. Some pathetic high school student would definitely be no match for him. After warming up, he suggested that Gucheon attack first, wanting to give the weakling at least some chance. When the boy didn't react, the small-time bandit decided that he had scared him so much that he had lost the power of speech. Only later did I realize that something was wrong with this guy. There was a huge pressure under the piercing gaze. The last thing I saw were bright red eyes that pierced me to the very bones. Looking at the enemy, the boy remembered his childhood. The training was suddenly interrupted by 7 blows to the head. The mentor came to scold the boy for his incorrect movements. Deciding to give it a last chance, he showed the correct technique. After all, everyone needs to know the basics of martial arts for defense and attack. These basics are footwork. Most masters used their legs to avoid blows or maintain distance. True masters limited the enemy's movements and changed their position for a convenient attack. The leader of the demonic cult demonstrated what he was talking about by moving behind the boy in a second. He now performed the same maneuver on his opponent. A frightened cry rang out, and turning around, the guy looked at the fist aimed for a blow. Finally, there was an explanation. This boy was not his equal, since he had not learned even the most basic principles. One blow sent the pathetic school thug flying towards the nearest wall, breaking a hole in it. Dust from the destruction rose into the air. As if nothing had happened, the hero looked at his guys, making it clear that there was nothing to worry about. None of these guys were his equal. The two surviving opponents looked up at Sangu, clearly not expecting such strength. Gucheon didn't let them leave. He calmly looked at everyone's faces as he approached, seeing their fear. In the end, he even decided to do us a favor and allowed everyone to attack at once. Then the guys thought that they definitely had a chance and rushed into battle, but they didn't have enough time to even take a couple of steps. They were instantly defeated by the hero's inhuman strength. There was one last opponent left, who cowardly tucked his tail between his legs and put his fists out. The hero immediately attacked him with such speed that Sangu did not have time to defend himself. The last thing he did was open his mouth wide in surprise. The frightened question concerned who this man in front of him really was. Before striking, the hero calmly introduced himself as the strongest among all the people of the demonic cult. The blow made everything around shake, and a wind appeared that almost blew away his own subordinates. Once the dust settled, everyone saw Sangu lying on the ground, completely crushed, and the hero was already stretching out his demonic hands to test the strength of the new slave. But first I decided to look at the reward, so that I wouldn't have to beg the system for it later. As promised, he was indeed given a restorative herb. Quite a good gift, even better than expected. With its help you can patch up a miserable body. After which he again turned his attention to the lying beaten hooligans and immediately approached the leader. He started hitting him in the face, trying to bring him back to his senses. After all, it seemed to him that he couldn't really be unconscious, considering that Gucheon didn't even use martial arts. His own comrades were astonished by the cruelty with which their leader beat the unfortunate man. After the showdown ended, the hero returned to the school walls. The classmates whispered again, not believing their own eyes. Trash was riding through the school again, but now he was sitting like a king on Sangu's shoulders. At this time, he calmly shared with the new slaves that he was in search of one organization. He wanted to find a demonic cult, and he said it so seriously that everyone instantly went silent. Sangu raised his head so high in surprise that he almost fell backwards along with Gucheon. And naturally, he got hit on the head so that he wouldn't make the same mistakes next time. The guy started asking the guys if they had heard anything like magical cults, Shaolin, Huashan. Modern guys heard about something like this for the first time. For this reason, Gucheon threatened to beat up Sangu right now if he didn't remember at least one of the things mentioned. As it turned out, the guy knew a man nicknamed the Best Chonim Blade. Gucheon was even horrified and demanded an immediate explanation from Sangu. Soon he was sitting in the classroom, rocking back and forth in his chair out of boredom. Finally, the first bell rang. Sangu said that as soon as 3 bells rang, the one the hero wanted to meet should come here. The classroom doors creaked open. Gucheon froze, looking at the one who entered under the name of Best Chonim Blade. It was an ordinary teacher with a stick in his hands, ordering the students to immediately open their textbooks. Naturally, no one dared to say anything against it. The Korean teacher Park Chonim would not leave them unpunished. Gucheon was surprised. How could this man be called the Chonim Blade? It infuriated him that the man had such a title. He decided to punish him harshly so that he would no longer disgrace the title of true masters of martial arts. The anger of the new slaves in the other class even sent shivers down their spines in anticipation. Meanwhile, Gucheon was trying his best to calm down. He realized that he had disappointed himself with his expectations that there could be other martial arts masters in this world. If someone were here, they would have already felt their internal energy. But he also began to get angry at his idiot subordinates who gave him such stupid information. At that very moment, Gucheon felt something flying at high speed straight towards his head. The guy instinctively tried to grab the flying object between his fingers, but for some unknown reason he did not have time to react. A piece of chalk hit him right on the head with a dull sound. Pain pierced his skull and the hero screamed loudly, jumping up sharply onto his desk. His eyes frantically scanned the class, searching for the one who dared to try to kill him. Of course, the other students and the teacher took such a violent reaction as a sign of some serious diagnosis, and perhaps even real madness. The teacher calmly addressed the unruly student, demanding that the boy come closer to the board. It was only at this moment that Gucheon finally realized that it was this man who had suddenly attacked him. But the hero couldn't help but be surprised by his own incompetent behavior. How could he not catch even this pathetic attack with such a slow item? The boy screamed loudly throughout the class, indignant at how idiotic his current body turned out to be. Watching the students screaming at the whole school, the teacher was finally convinced that he was dealing with a real madman. The man coldly informed him that the boy had been ordered to go to the board. The hero just looked angrily at the teacher who dared to say something to him at a time when Guchen was overcome with negative emotions. But still, the young man had to take a deep breath and remember that he was in a completely different world, which was radically different from his previous life. The boy slowly rose from his seat and walked towards teacher Park Chonam, who was standing near the board. However, at the last moment, the hero turned around abruptly, and instead of approaching the teacher, he headed straight for the exit of the classroom. The angry teacher immediately grabbed the impudent boy by the collar, using his iron grip. Such insolence infuriated him quite a bit. As if not paying attention to the boy's seething anger, the man ordered the boy to explain where he was going while the lesson was still going on. The teacher was clearly angry at the ill-mannered children of our time. They had no manners and even banal respect for their teachers. Gucheon clearly couldn't help but be infuriated by the fact that this teacher continued to drone on with his moralizing. The young man calmly made it clear that he was not going to listen to the man who was called the best Chonam blade. But in fact he turned out to be an ordinary weakling. Park Jongnam was clearly surprised to hear the boy call him. This was not something a normal high school student would know, so the man demanded that the impudent fellow explain himself. Gucheon clearly didn't understand what the old man wanted from him. The boy angrily demanded that he let him go and let him leave in peace. But at that moment, the teacher ordered the rest of the class to study on their own, and he demanded that the impudent boy silently follow him for a serious conversation. That's how these two ended up on the hero's usual school roof. The guy clearly didn't understand why. As soon as something happened, everyone immediately called him here. Park Chonam couldn't help but be offended by the brazen words of this boy, but he still decided to find out whether the boy was from Chonam. Such suspicions offended the hero quite a bit. The young man immediately began to yell that he would never have come from such a miserable office. Park Chonam, clearly offended by his words, did not understand how this guy could talk to him like that. The teacher clearly thought that Gucheon was literally asking for serious trouble, but the hero looked at him as if he were some kind of madman, not understanding why everyone in this strange world, as soon as he said something wrong, immediately began to threaten him. At this tense moment, Park Jongnam frowned and demanded that Gucheon give an honest answer to his question. No matter how much the teacher demanded an explanation, the boy continued to look at him with an absolutely neutral expression on his face, without uttering a single word. Because of this silence, the man laughed bitterly, realizing that it seemed he would not get anything out of the stubborn boy. Seeing how the teacher began to laugh strangely and ominously, the hero decided to parody his facial expression. As a result, they both froze like two fools, making ridiculous faces at each other. It ended with the teacher, completely enraged, suddenly attacking Gucheon with a pointer in his hands. The man tried to hit the impudent boy, aiming approximately at his torso. However, what was his sincere surprise when the attack simply did not happen. Instead of the expected blow, Gucheon easily stopped the pointer in the hands of the enraged man. Of course, the teacher was amazed by such incredible strength from an ordinary high school student who didn't even flinch when they tried to attack him. After that, the teacher felt the murderous gaze of this guy on his body. It seemed that the sharp gaze was already cutting him into tiny pieces. Immediately, the only thought that arose in the man's head was that he would definitely die at that moment. The hero reflexively reacted to the threat and abruptly threw the teacher onto the hard ground. Only then did Park Chonam realize what a fatal mistake it had been to interfere with this crazy student. The man immediately tried to fight off the enraged opponent by attacking with his leg. But the blow was also easily stopped by the unperturbed Gucheon. At this turning point, the young man realized that he had finally met a man like himself, a true master of martial arts. After this discovery, the hero threw Park Chonam away from himself. However, the teacher, skillfully grouping himself in the air, landed on the ground easily and gracefully. Only at that moment did the boy realize with horror that his hands had begun to tremble treacherously for some unknown reason. The guy again began to indignantly look at his crooked and stupid body, not understanding why he was the one who got such a worthless incarnation. After that, Gucheon tried to hit his shaking hand, hoping to finally stop the treacherous trembling. But when this didn't help at all, the hero was about to beat himself up thoroughly. The young man hoped that at least after such a harsh shake-up his body would return to normal. Park Chonam, looking closely at the strange boy, clearly did not understand what was happening to him now. The teacher heard this boy talking about martial arts masters, but it seemed extremely strange and unbelievable to him. But really, the guy in front of him was undoubtedly using real martial arts. It looked especially strange considering the fact that the finger was acting as if a completely different person had taken up residence in his body. The man remembered that this student had always been a quiet and modest guy before, but perhaps he was just trying to hide his true abilities. But looking at how the boy was now screaming and demanding that something appear in front of him, Gucheon simply looked like the local complete madman. Therefore, the teacher simply froze in confusion, not knowing what to say or how to properly comment on what was happening. Noticing the teacher's intent and scrutinizing gaze on himself, the hero immediately looked at him questioningly. The guy demanded some clear explanations from this suspicious guy for such obsessive attention. Park Jong-nam was clearly outraged that some brat dared to speak to him so informally and impudently. The man was simply going to kill this impudent scoundrel who did not respect his teaching authority. But still, the teacher needed to calm down and first make sure of the true identity of the mysterious boy. The teacher honestly admitted that the fact that the boy turned out to be a master of martial arts greatly surprised him as an experienced teacher. But the man warned him that he couldn't use his art indiscriminately. If Gu Qian continued to do so, he would definitely run into serious trouble. Only then did the hero finally realize what his teacher had been muttering boringly about all this time. However, the boy calmly warned that it was not he who should worry. The teacher's real troubles began when he ran into Gu Qian himself. Immediately, under the incinerating gaze of the young man, the frightened Park Chanam screamed. It was absolutely impossible to kill him. After all, he was the teacher of this boy. The man apologized, admitting that attacking the student earlier was a huge and unforgivable mistake. However, when the boy did not stop and continued to approach closer threateningly, the teacher squeezed the pointer tighter in his trembling hands. The man then stood in front of the enraged student, determined to teach him a serious life lesson. But even in the face of such determination, the hero was not at all afraid. On the contrary, the guy only laughed happily, having received exactly the reaction he passionately wanted to see. Gu Qian wanted to thoroughly check whether this man was truly worthy of his loud title of the best Cheonim blade. Park Chanam was firmly aware that he could not leave this impudent boy unpunished. After all, he was a teacher and simply could not calmly watch his student completely stray from the righteous path. For this compelling reason, the man, relying on his advanced age and rich life experience, decided to give the impudent man his very last warning. The teacher sternly stated that informal speech could not be used with adults, otherwise the boy would be severely punished. However, Gu Qian had no idea what the boring teacher was hinting at. The boy decided to find out directly what would happen to him if he continued to speak so insolently. Then Park Chanam finally realized that it was absolutely useless to talk nicely with this stubborn boy. The impudent fellow had once again boldly crossed all acceptable boundaries. So now he, Park Chanam, will wholeheartedly teach this brat some truly good behavior and respect for his elders. Immediately after these words, the teacher rushed from his seat, rapidly approaching the ill-mannered student. The man pointed the pointer straight at the boy's face. However, at the last moment, Gu Qian managed to dodge the attack, and then blocked the blow aimed at the head. Thus, by issuing various attacks, Park Jong-nam began to press the enemy against the wall so that he had nowhere to run. After this, the teacher rushed at the boy, wanting to knock all the nonsense out of this bastard's head. At that moment, the young man noticed a mop standing to his left. The next moment, the boy grabbed the instrument and threw it far above the teacher's head. In this way, he managed to distract the enemy. For just a moment, the man raised his gaze to the sky. Taking advantage of this, the hero attacked by jumping on the enemy and using his knee to strike. At the last moment, the teacher managed to defend himself by putting up a block with his hand. However, the teacher mentally scolded himself for a long time for losing his vigilance during the battle. It was extremely pitiful, considering the amount of experience he had accumulated. On the other hand, his student, although very young, already possessed incredible strength. Most likely, the boy reached such a level because he trained hard in secret from everyone. Indeed, Park Chanam could not help but admit that he was sincerely delighted with his protégé's talent. At this tense moment, the man smiled a maniacal smile that even embarrassed Gu Qian. The boy nervously asked the teacher to stop giggling like an idiot. However, instead of answering, Park Chanam simply pointed his weapon directly at the boy, after which he asked him not to get distracted. On the contrary, now it was necessary to gather all our strength. The teacher prepared to use the 36 heavenly swords of Jeonnam technique. Seeing the impending attack, the hero immediately broke the mop in order to make an elongated sword out of it. Twisting the weapon in his hands, the boy remembered how often the head of the cult scolded him for his habit of spinning weapons like some kind of circus performer. The mentor always said that such behavior leads to failure. However, since Gu Qian always won, he simply forgot about these words. After all, it was the opponents who were unlucky. So now the young man decided to show the teacher how to perform the technique of the real 36 heavenly swords of Cheonim. Seeing the student's fighting stance, even the teacher's eyes widened in surprise. The man realized that the boy would never cease to amaze. Moreover, he sincerely admitted that he hadn't had such a feeling for a long time when he was sparring with a worthy opponent. Little did these two realize that they were not alone. They had a small feathered observer. However, as soon as the opponents met in battle, the bird flew away, frightened by the inhuman power. The fighters clashed, repeating the same technique of the 36 heavenly swords. They exchanged blows like madmen, clearly delighted by the battle that was taking place. But at this critical moment, Park Chanam noticed that the stick he had been wielding like a sword was beginning to crack at the seams. As soon as the man was distracted from his position, he received such an attack that everything around him began to fly apart into tiny pieces. It would seem that after such a blow, the teacher could have died. However, he remained alive and unharmed, all because an unknown person came and stopped the schoolboy's attack in time. Park Jongnam was speechless at the sight of his savior. The phantom killer was standing before him, but the schoolboy didn't know this man. He was just angry that someone had interrupted the wonderful battle. However, after these words, he only gave the hero an uncomprehending and slightly angry look. Gucheon, however, did not experience such fear, so he immediately ordered the degenerate to be released immediately. However, the alien didn't even move, which made the boy even more furious. So the young man pulled his hand back. The phantom assassin immediately retreated. In the end, I just looked at the hero as if he was a real asshole for what he did. And then he explained to the guy that he had violated the rules of the martial arts union. Namely, he thoughtlessly applied art and betrayed the sacredness of Murim himself. Those who violate the laws of Murim must be punished to the fullest extent of the law. Gucheon didn't understand a word that came out of the boy's mouth. He just sighed in displeasure, thinking that the world had gone crazy. He didn't understand when martial artists became so sacred. The phantom killer was infuriated by the kid's behavior. The boy used martial arts on a civilian but still boldly argues with him. However, it was too late now. Gucheon himself did not understand what kind of civilian was being discussed. He pointed at Park Jongnam, who didn't look like an ordinary civilian at all. And in principle, he also used the so-called martial arts, although even these words could be argued. After all, the boy believed that such weak techniques could not be considered martial arts, and even accused the newcomer of very low standards. However, the phantom assassin only explained in a reserved manner. The standards for using martial arts are set by normal people, not by a kid like a regular high school student. In any case, be that as it may, the union will judge the boy. After which he decided to ask the schoolboy if he knew who the phantom killer was. Gucheon didn't understand the purpose of this question at all. Besides, he wondered how much this pathetic guy was paid. It seemed that with such weak skills, he would probably be paid as a salesman. Park Chanam immediately realized how stupid his student had said, and the man who came was so furious that he did not say a word. He calmly pulled the weapon over his shoulder, explaining, "The phantom assassins stop the thoughtless use of martial arts. They also ensure order in the world and protect civilians. They are literally the shield of Murim." The heavenly demon reincarnation barely held back a chuckle. After all, with such a weak shield, he could easily break the head of this phantom killer. The hero was clearly enraged that wherever he stepped, he encountered similar people obsessed with justice. This justice, which was pretty annoying, he wanted to destroy once and for all. At this point, a concerned teacher intervened in their squabble. He explained to the young man who appeared that there had been some misunderstanding between them, and he pretended that he didn't understand at all what martial arts were being discussed. Of course, the teacher understood that this was a matter for the union itself. But the phantom killer could turn a blind eye to this once, and then Park Chanam would promise that this would never happen again. But the newcomer saw no reason to spare this student, considering that he was simply doing his duty. Park Jongnam didn't argue, because he knew the work of the phantom killers very well. But he still asked the guy to have mercy at least once. He was seriously determined to tie up this slacker today, who was behaving too brazenly. In the end, the poor teacher had no choice but to scream loudly. This slacker was his student. Immediately after these words, everyone froze. An extremely awkward silence ensued, and soon the enraged hero just hit Park Chanam on the head with a stick for saying some stupid things. After all, such a weakling could not be a mentor to such a master as him. But it seems that the phantom killer believed Park Jongnam's words. However, he was clearly furious that this man dared to take such a worthless person as his student. Gucheon immediately tried to argue, not understanding what was being discussed. But Park Chanam arrived at the boy's side in time and quickly shut his mouth, after which he calmly explained that this boy was his student. Of course, he is not yet very advanced in martial arts and does not know many of the rules. That's exactly why Park Jongnam begged the phantom killer to forgive the kid this time. After all, the boy is just starting his journey. This means that if he is taken to the union, he will be called simply a dangerous criminal. But this little one has not seen the world yet, and the union will not take such trifles into account. And the teacher really wanted this child's future to be happy, and not destroyed due to the teacher's fault. That's why he asked the phantom killer to help. It was probably fate that brought this guy to them today. After the words about fate, the visitor only sadly lowered his eyes, not understanding how Park Chanam, after everything that had happened, could believe in such superstitions. But still, at the request of an old friend, he put his weapon over his shoulder without using it. Realizing that he was going to leave in peace, the teacher immediately began to shower him with gratitude. However, before leaving, the Phantom Killer explained that he had felt a strong presence that morning. It must have been from that boy who was in the civilian school. The man promised that he would forgive the boy only this time and would not give him any more concessions. Of course, the teacher was grateful for this chance alone, after which he finally thanked the respected Phantom Killer. When the stranger left, the teacher was able to breathe a sigh of relief, glad that the danger had passed. Immediately after this, from the horror and fear he had experienced, he lost consciousness, falling right at the feet of his own student. The hero was still indignant, not understanding. Where did Park Jong-nam get such incredible strength from? The hero could only break free from the teacher's iron grip when the teacher himself decided to let go. Listening to the stormy indignation of this stubborn boy, the teacher realized that they still had a lot to discuss. Soon they were comfortably settled on the roof of the school, finally having the opportunity to calmly talk about everything the boy needed to know to survive in this strange world. That's how Gucheon realized the shocking truth. In this reality, he was absolutely forbidden to use martial arts without special permission. This restriction did not suit the young man at all, which the teacher did not understand at all. As it turned out, the boy simply didn't like the fact that someone dared to come up with stupid rules about how he should manage his own powers. In the end, Park Chan-nam had to patiently explain that times had changed dramatically, and people could no longer survive solely through brute physical force. After these sad words, the hero was once again convinced that he had indeed ended up in a truly terrible world. Moreover, the boy was very surprised that teacher Park Chan-nam continued to obediently follow these idiotic rules like an obedient lamb. Of course, Park Jong-nam couldn't help but be angered by the fact that after everything he had gone through today, the boy continued to treat him without the slightest respect. However, the man quickly realized that it was better not to bring up such sensitive topics with this student. Therefore, it was much easier to put up with informal communication than to try to explain anything to this stubborn man. And so the hero remained lying on the hard ground, deeply thinking about the strange and incomprehensible world into which fate had thrown his soul. But if martial arts existed here, then surely the legendary demon cult was hiding somewhere. Therefore, the young man immediately stood up abruptly, eager to ask his teacher this extremely important question. But to the boy's great shock, the place where the man had just been sitting peacefully was no longer there. By this time, Park Chan-nam had already hurried back down to the school walls and continued his boring lesson. The angry boy immediately loudly demanded that the teacher immediately stay and answer all the vital questions. But he only condescendingly reminded that a student can afford to skip class. But the teacher bears much more responsibility in this regard. The man kindly offered to talk to the angry child a little later, but for now, they urgently needed to return to class before the end of classes. Of course, Gucheon couldn't believe that at this moment, some stupid lesson was much more important to Park Jong-nam than providing vital information. The teacher understood perfectly well why boring lessons so irritated such an eccentric and talented student. But still, for him, as a responsible teacher, classes were really more important than any chatter. Therefore, having once again suggested to Gucheon to go to class with him, the man calmly headed towards his home office. In the end, the teacher decisively slammed the heavy doors, and the guy was left completely alone, lying on the cold ground. Now he had to be sad because he still hadn't received the long-awaited answers to the questions that tormented him. The teacher felt no better than his strange protege. The man only let out a heavy sigh after the tense conversation ended. The problem was that Park Jong-nam was still trying to figure out what was happening with this mysterious world. Just at that fateful moment, another scroll appeared in front of the boy's face, this time in a purple color, which he had never seen before. Soon the hero returned to his usual classroom as if nothing had happened. There was nothing more interesting to do, and there was no point in staying on the empty roof of the school either. All the classmates saw perfectly well how frightening and dangerous their former quiet boy had become. However, the boys tried hard not to attract the attention of their formidable comrade, mortally afraid of receiving a painful retribution for their excessive curiosity. Gucheon himself looked frankly bored for one simple reason. He felt unbearably sad in this primitive environment. Therefore, in order to somehow distract himself from the gray everyday life, the young man again looked closely at the mysterious purple scroll, mysteriously shimmering before his eyes. It turned out to be a special mission, the progress of which was only 30%. As a result, not knowing how exactly to complete this task, the hero simply lay down on the hard desk, deciding to take a little nap and gain strength. When all the boring lessons were over, and the boy still hadn't woken up from his deep sleep, Park Chan-nam had to personally approach the sleeping student to gently wake him up. The teacher tapped his pointer softly on the wooden table, trying to get the boy up so they could finally talk calmly. The hero immediately woke up, instantly realizing that he had literally passed out from the incredible fatigue he had experienced during this incredibly strange and eventful day. Apparently, Park Jong-nam was shocked by the boy's rather calm reaction to the fact that today he was almost taken away by the real Phantom Killer. As a result, after this, a rather frank conversation took place between the two unusual individuals. Since Gu Cheon had managed to get a good night's sleep, his clouded mind cleared up a bit. Only then did the young man fully realize what an incredible bunch of strange and inexplicable things were happening to him. Looking back on the events of the past day, the guy realized something shocking. When he tried to say his real name, the words he spoke seemed to dissolve into empty air. Because of such mystical oddities, the young man suddenly remembered the wise words of his former teacher. He constantly asked me to think with my head and not act rashly. However, now the hero was simply not allowed to act normally. He could not even reveal his true identity and origin to anyone. While Gu Cheon was deep in thought about these disturbing thoughts, Park Jong-nam continued to enthusiastically tell something until he noticed that the boy was not listening to him at all. As a result, the young man realized what an awkward situation he had managed to get into. In order to cleverly get out of the unpleasant situation, the guy immediately theatrically fell onto the cold ground and desperately grabbed his head. He pretended that after today's blow, his skull was splitting into painful little pieces. Unfortunately, he can't remember a single thing about what the respected teacher had just said so enthusiastically. The experienced man looked as if he absolutely did not believe such pathetic antics of his cunning student. The teacher's face only distorted from obvious misunderstanding and disapproval of what was happening. So the poor schoolboy had no choice but to shamefully end this humiliating scene and rise with dignity from the solid ground. Gu Cheon was extremely indignant and angry that this insightful old man had so quickly and accurately figured out that this entire carefully planned scene was a complete lie from beginning to end. But at that moment, the teacher finally truly realized and understood why the boy had changed his behavior so abruptly and radically in such a short time. The schoolboy literally found himself in some incredibly difficult test that any real protagonist of an adventure story must overcome. Since Park Jong-nam was his kind-hearted teacher, the man simply could not indifferently ignore the mental suffering of his poor and unfortunate student. For this noble reason, the teacher generously decided to provide the boy with all-round assistance in everything possible. Of course, Gu Cheon was completely amazed and surprised by the naivety of this simple-minded simpleton, and even mentally considered him a real idiot and blockhead. However, the old man was definitely extremely useful to him in the current situation, so the cunning young man decided to carefully ask this gullible teacher whether there was something in this mysterious world under the ominous name of demonic cult. At that moment, the joyful smile instantly disappeared from the friendly face of the best sword of Cheonam, and the teacher became incredibly curious and strange as to why his students suddenly started talking about such dangerous things. Immediately wincing with awkwardness, the guy realized that he seemed to have seriously overdone it with his persistent questions and had inadvertently crossed some forbidden line. However, the honest teacher openly admitted to the young man that he was not at all sure of the real existence of this sinister cult. The teacher suggested that most likely such an organization does not exist in nature at all, which absolutely could not help but upset the disappointed student to the depths of his soul. The best sword of Cheonam, looking attentively at the obvious bewilderment and confusion of the student, patiently explained to the boy that the mysterious demonic cult had been completely destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth many long years ago by experienced warriors. The poor hero had to quickly justify himself and explain to the teacher that he simply sincerely wanted to learn and find out what exactly he should be afraid of, and what threats might lie in wait in this incredibly strange and incomprehensible world. Just at this opportune moment, the long-awaited school lessons finally ended safely, and the protagonist's friend came into the teacher's office. The girl came here specifically to go home with Genjin after classes. Gu Cheon looked at the unfamiliar girl with distrust and confusion. Her pretty face was definitely vaguely familiar to him, but the young man absolutely did not understand and could not remember who she really was. Only after some time did the hero suddenly understand and realize that it was this kind girl who had carefully taken him to the school nurse's office when he needed medical help. At that very moment, the modest schoolgirl bowed politely and greeted the respected teacher, who kindly asked the young girl to introduce herself and state her name. The calm student then calmly informed those present that she was Minjung from the 3rd grade, where the teacher also taught Korean. The quick-witted teacher immediately realized that young Minjona had come to the office solely to pick up her friend Genjin and take him home safely. For this understandable reason, the kind teacher said a warm farewell to the student and generously decided not to detain the young people from their important affairs any longer. Looking closely at the boy's obvious discontent and irritation, the man sincerely promised that they would definitely meet tomorrow the next day, and if the schoolboy had any serious questions, they would definitely talk about everything in detail. Apparently, the stubborn Gu Cheon vehemently protested against such a hasty decision, because the persistent youth had no desire to suddenly interrupt their extremely important and useful conversation right now. However, the wise teacher only smiled good-naturedly at his disobedient student in farewell, secretly glad that he had finally managed to get rid of this incredibly annoying and intrusive guy. Soon the main character, together with his patient girlfriend, was already leisurely walking along a busy street, absent-mindedly listening to her carefree chatter about nothing particularly important. Meanwhile, the smart guy understood perfectly well that this mysterious world would definitely not be so peaceful, calm, and safe if an evil demonic cult really existed. However, the complete absence of this dangerous organization still caused deep sadness and regret in the disappointed young man. Then the confused hero suddenly remembered that he had absolutely no idea where exactly he and the kind Minjona were heading and going. That's why the confused boy only now finally dared to ask his companion where they were heading so purposefully. Not at all surprised by such a strange question, the girl calmly explained to her friend that they were going home to rest. This unexpected news absolutely could not help but shock the reincarnation of the heavenly demon to the depths of his soul. The young man simply could not believe that he really lived with an unfamiliar girl under the same roof. The practical friend rightly considered that this difficult day had finally squeezed all the life juices out of the poor guy, and carefully reminded him that they had lived peacefully together for 3 long years already. After that, looking sympathetically at his extremely awkward and confused face, the girl kindly suggested that they hurry home as soon as possible in order to have a good rest and regain their strength. Moreover, the caring dad promised that he would definitely prepare something incredibly tasty and appetizing for them after tiring school activities. This tempting promise was exactly what managed to finally convince Gucheon, who was seriously hungry after today's busy day. Therefore, the practical hero wisely decided to have a good snack first, and only after that think thoroughly about what would be best for him to do next. The young man was about to obediently follow the patient girl, when suddenly he was seized with some extremely strange and alarming premonition of impending danger. The hero's face changed dramatically and darkened in an instant, which the attentive girl walking next to him could not help but notice. However, at that moment, the alarmed Genjin suddenly grabbed her fragile hand and immediately dragged her in the exact opposite direction from their original path. The frightened companion was seriously frightened by what was happening, and naively thought that her friend was very angry because he was incredibly hungry. The girl even promised never to touch his portion of food again. The poor schoolgirl had no idea that at this dangerous moment her friend was in real and mortal danger. They were relentlessly pursued by completely unknown and suspicious people, whose identities the alarmed Gucheon did not know at all and could not determine. Soon the guy, holding the frightened girl tightly by the hand, quickly reached the high wall, which hopelessly blocked their further path to salvation. Only then did the desperate hero realize with horror that they had absolutely nowhere else to run or hide from their pursuers. At that moment, the mysterious little people who had been relentlessly chasing the schoolchildren finally stopped at a safe distance, carefully and expectantly watching their victims. They purposefully followed the frightened Guchun because he was their main target. They clearly heard the words that the boy said while at school. Besides, the smart boy intuitively felt that these dangerous guys had been secretly watching him for a long time, so they probably made the right choice of victim. Although the enemies understood perfectly well that the schoolboy had finally reached a hopeless dead end, they rightly believed that this happened only because of his childhood failure, because after all, he was still just a child. However, at that critical moment, while the self-confident opponents were chatting carelessly among themselves, the cunning Gucheon literally disappeared without a trace from their surprised eyes. In the place where the young man had just stood, only his faithful girlfriend remained, peacefully and serenely sleeping on her own school backpack. All the pursuers immediately began to nervously boil and desperately try to find the missing hero, who in the meantime had independently and unnoticed approached them from behind. The guy was clearly offended by the unpleasant circumstance that these pathetic little people naively thought that he had cowardly fled from danger. Therefore, the indignant hero calmly explained to his opponents that such worthless losers were absolutely nothing to him, and he saw no point in running away from such weaklings. Not long before this, naive Minjona sincerely believed that her absent-minded friend had completely forgotten the usual way home, so the caring girl calmly turned around, intending to independently lead her friend along the correct route. The schoolgirl even asked the guy to remember the route more carefully next time. Only then did the quick-witted Guchen realize that this kind girl had not noticed anything strange about the events that were happening. Therefore, the caring young man decided to carefully put his naive companion to bed for a short time in order to reliably hide all the dangerous things from her innocent eyes. However, the prudent hero still needed to urgently come up with a plausible excuse for why the girl suddenly went to bed right in the middle of a busy street. At this moment, the first of the opponents had already lost consciousness from his single powerful blow. Meanwhile, the smug guy just smiled contemptuously, hanging easily on the electric wire and looking disdainfully at the next intended target. However, this experienced warrior was not at all a simple amateur, and furiously attacked the impudent schoolboy in order to cruelly punish the impudent boy. But just as the enraged enemy was about to deal a crushing blow to the hero, he immediately disappeared, as if he had never been there. At this decisive moment, the agile youth was already high above and aimed precisely to deliver a fatal blow to his enemy. At the very last moment, a second enemy ran to the aid of his comrade, managing to defend himself from the unexpected attack with his sharp blade. But even under such circumstances, under the incredible pressure of the enraged hero, the defending warrior flew onto solid ground with a deafening roar, stopping only upon collision with the hard asphalt. Then all the remaining opponents froze in place, looking at the mysterious schoolboy in bewilderment and confusion, clearly not understanding who this mysterious guy really was. The enemies finally realized that they had made a truly huge mistake when they had carelessly started tracking him down. The surprised hero was amazed that these self-confident types did not even bother to properly study their target, so they were completely unprepared for such an unexpected turn of events. At this point, the only girl on the opposing team sensibly suggested running away immediately, knowing full well that they were clearly not worthy opponents for this incredible schoolboy. However, her stubborn comrade was categorically against shamefully retreating just because of one supposedly weak idiot. But that was not the point at all. The girl simply had a keen intuition that this mysterious schoolboy was much more dangerous than all the other opponents they had encountered before. Her comrade was clearly puzzled that the fighting girl was so scared of just some ordinary school kids. At this tense moment, their captain finally came to his senses and angrily demanded that his subordinate should under no circumstances dare to speak so disrespectfully to his loyal teammates. After this, having risen to his feet with difficulty, the commander sincerely apologized to his comrades for having briefly lost his vigilance. Nevertheless, after one blow from the schoolboy, the experienced warrior realized that they were facing a rather strong and dangerous bastard. The captain had no choice but to order the boys to immediately prepare their combat weapons and take the correct fighting stance. All this was required because, although the commander could forgive himself for this oversight, they could not make such mistakes again. After all, it was unclear. Perhaps this guy was still hiding a lot from them and was quite capable of killing them all. The hero, looking contemptuously at his confused opponents, openly laughed at their stupid words. In his time, no one talked such nonsense about losing vigilance. If the young man had not taken pity on him, he would have died long ago. However, the self-confident commander still could not admit this, so he immediately bit his tongue at the schoolboy's insolent words. After all, he had never heard such impudent words, even from the formidable leader of their team. The warrior was surprised that such things were boldly said to him by some brat. Now the opponents had no doubt that this guy was indeed very arrogant. However, they warned the overconfident Gucheon that he would die today, not only because of his sharp tongue, but also because he had meddled in matters he shouldn't have. However, respecting his strength, the captain decided to kill the boy with one painless blow. Immediately, at his command, his comrades armed themselves, drawing their sharp blades from their sheaths. Gucheon was clearly offended that some scumbag who would soon be lying unconscious on the ground was trying to intimidate him. Therefore, the indignant hero suggested that the man come up and try to attack him if he dared. Apparently, his confident words were capable of frightening everyone, given the confidence with which the young man presented it. All this time, the cunning hero hid the fact that his body moved as if made of wood. It was much weaker than he initially expected. The boy hoped that these guys would panic if he neutralized at least one of them. But it seems they were also martial artists, since they still didn't run away screaming. All he could do was hope that a system would suddenly appear that would offer him some kind of buff. Therefore, realizing that a duel could not be avoided, the brave young man ordered these scoundrels to attack him. The captain apologized, clearly thinking that the boy had some kind of mental problems. The commander did not understand why, in such a situation, the schoolboy continued to scream louder than everyone else. The warrior even thought that the enemy was behaving this way on purpose, perhaps trying to hide his panic. The quick-witted Gucheon was clearly unhappy that he had fallen for such a shrewd opponent. The young man was already facing death, and now he was being humiliated even more. However, while the indignant hero was fuming, the dangerous enemy had already approached him, raising his blade to strike. Of course, the clever guy managed to avoid a fatal wound, but it became obvious that his reaction was greatly slowed down. As a result, the determined captain ordered his comrades to immediately attack the enemy. However, he reminded his comrades that they should not kill the boy. The schoolboy should remain on the brink of death. The blade was literally a few centimeters away from Gucheon's face. The hero didn't care whether his body exploded or not. The young man only reminded them at the end that he had given these people a chance to escape. After which, the guy pressed on one of his meridians, causing powerful bursts of energy. The woman flying towards him was terrified by the mere light of his eyes. She asked her friend to stop and not to get into trouble, but it was too late. Guxian grabbed the bastard's hand and intercepted his blade in an instant. The schoolboy cut off his enemy's arm at the elbow. Only then did the captain realize that the boy had really been bluffing the whole time. As a result, the warrior fell to the ground, screaming in pain, and realizing that he had lost his right arm. Guxian barely held back a chuckle. Idiots, as always, only understand everything when they see their own blood. After being wounded, the warrior shouted that he would definitely finish off Guxian for what he had just done. Of course, the guy was amazed by the rudeness of this man. Therefore, the hero reminded that instead of a hand, he could easily have killed the enemy or torn out his tongue. After which the young man looked at his body, realizing that it was about to fall apart due to the use of instantaneous energy emissions. He might even have less than a measly 15 minutes left. The schoolboy once again found himself on the brink of life and death. However, Guxian was not sad at all. So that he would not be lonely in that world, the hero decided to take these idiots with him. So, rushing at them, the guy suggested that they all go together and see the leader of the demonic cult. However, his deadly attack was thwarted by the surviving captain. At the last moment, he tied the hero up with chains and made sure his team members were okay. However, the comrades explained that they needed reinforcements. The situation was extremely dangerous. Apparently, the commander did not understand why his soldiers needed reinforcements in the fight against the schoolboy. However, at that moment, Guxian grabbed the chain and threw the man away. The young man then broke the metal chain into links with his bare hands, showing that something like that would not be able to hold him back. One of the mercenaries remembered how she entered high school. She looked like a normal schoolgirl, but with her, everything was different. Among martial artists, it was a special school that nurtured young talents from prestigious families. That's why the school was special. And the girl came from a very ordinary family. However, she was selected as a scholarship recipient and was admitted here. There was nothing different about this school from a regular school except one thing. It's just that the concept of power has changed along with the rest of the world. Strength used to mean martial arts and nobility. Strength today means political power or authority. It took her only half a day at this school to realize her powerless position. To the local school children, she was just an outsider who didn't fit in anywhere. In order to somehow survive, the girl pretended that she was not there, observing the mood of those around her. Perhaps it was precisely in comparison with others that her sensitivity and intuition became so good. She endured everything until graduation day. Finally, thanks to hard work, the girl was able to enter a good university. And that day she met the team leader for the first time. He invited her to join the Dark Unit. In simple terms, it was the team that did the dirty work. And she belonged to the weakest team, number 7. Of course, many would have questions. Why, having suffered so much, did she agree to do such work? The thing is that this girl was the eldest daughter. She was obliged to revive the family. Besides, these people paid well. For a simple girl to get such an opportunity was already a great success. After all, she lived, always digging in trash cans. And she thought that if she became even a little stronger, then life would get better. However, the girl was wrong. Nothing changed. But at least she could take care of her younger brothers and sisters, so that they would not live like her. Of course, she described herself very nobly, but the work that Team 7 did was often very strange. It was also astonishing that even surveillance of a schoolboy ended in such an ending. But what interested her most now was what kind of monster they had met on their way. At that moment, Gucheon turned to the frightened girl sitting on the ground. The guy understood from the very beginning that she was different from the others, and was good at reading the situation. That's why he agreed to give her a choice. First, she could run away from here right now without looking back, and then she would survive. But in that case, the rest will be torn to pieces and die by his hand. Second, she could kill him and then she would save everyone. Obviously, the girl didn't understand what kind of nonsense this monster was talking. However, standing above her, the hero gave her the right to choose the decision that she liked. Looking back at her comrades, the mercenary had absolutely no idea what this guy expected from her. However, she decided to stall for time in the hope that reinforcements would arrive. Guxian literally felt what the girl was thinking, so the hero explained that even if someone came, nothing would change for her. And at that moment, the mercenary finally understood her position. This schoolboy was sitting right now and looking down on her. At this moment, Guxian got tired of waiting. So the guy got up from his knees and calmly explained that the girl's silence would be her end. After all, she had failed to amuse him. All that is left for her now is to die with everyone else. Obviously frightened, she asked the guy to give her just one moment to think. At that moment, the hero was already stretching out his hands towards her, trying to kill her. So at the last second, the girl screamed loudly that she had a third option that she wanted to choose. Apparently, Gucheon got angry, not understanding what the third option was, considering that he only suggested 2. However, with shaking hands, the girl explained that just a second ago the hero was on edge, as if something was chasing him. As he said, nothing will change no matter who comes here. This means that Gucheon is probably in trouble now. Their captain's initial judgment was correct. He saw the weakness he had at that moment. However, the hero turned out to be an unsurpassed master, and the fact that they missed this was precisely the reason for their defeat. Therefore, kneeling down, the mercenary handed the hero a round box. It contained pills that were given to them every month to increase their internal energy. If used, they can help Gucheon deal with energy problems. Apparently, the guy was amazed when he saw how many pills were in the box. It seemed as if this girl was saving them on purpose. However, just from its appearance, it was clear that this was a low-grade medicine. They weren't even suitable as an addition to his regular food. The girl did not take them because she was not a weakling and she knew that these drugs were weak. However, by screaming, she reminded the hero that he was, after all, an unsurpassed master. This means that even with such worthless pills and with the help of internal energy, he will be able to assimilate them. But even if this doesn't suit him, the guy could set his own conditions for her, and she will fulfill them in any way. After which, the girl fell silent, bowing her head and waiting for an answer. Although even in her thoughts, this proposal sounded so useless that they would definitely not be pardoned because of it. Besides, even in her hands were pills of the lowest possible level. This meant one thing. Someone as insignificant as she would not be able to obtain anything valuable. She won't be able to run away either, because no matter how much she wants to, she faces death for such betrayal. For this reason, grabbing the blade, the girl decided to kill the hero, hoping that then her younger ones would be taken care of with dignity. She raised her weapon and immediately ordered Gucheon to defend himself. But the boy was behind her in an instant. The hero ate the pills offered by the girl in every possible way and ate some kind of grass. Feeling the blank stares, Gucheon explained that the mercenary was a true genius. He himself forgot that there really was a third option. This third option was the reward, the recovery herb he received immediately after appearing in this world. So the magnanimous hero let the frightened girl go, and graciously allowed her to carefully look after her wounded friends. Looking closely at his absolutely calm face, the shocked mercenary finally realized that the good guy was not lying to her at all. The young man really was generously letting them go free. After which the determined schoolboy also carefully grabbed his sleeping friend and firmly decided to immediately go home in order to finally have a good meal. And since the smart girl generously offered to take the healing pills, the practical hero also wisely decided to keep them for himself just in case. After this, the unperturbed guy, as if nothing had happened, without even saying goodbye to his opponents, calmly began to walk away from the battlefield. Even the experienced mercenary found it hard to believe that this terrible monster would really leave so easily and simply. The brave hero calmly explained to his confused enemies that he was simply honestly fulfilling the promises he had made to them. However, the formidable young man seriously warned that if these impudent scoundrels sat on his tail again, then they would definitely die a painful death. These ominous words brought incredible relief to the frightened mercenary, joyfully realizing that she had miraculously managed to escape certain death. The grateful girl immediately bowed respectfully, sincerely thanking the unrivaled master for his unexpected mercy. She hoped with all her heart that they would never meet again in life, because it was much better for everyone. So soon the tired hero found himself on the deserted night streets of the city, and realized with annoyance that he had absolutely no idea where to go. As a result, the confused guy had to carefully wake up the sleepy girl so that she would take him home on the right way. Soon they found themselves at the high walls of the temple, where they were to enter. However, the caring Minjona immediately sternly warned the absent-minded Genjin that since it was quite late, he definitely shouldn't make noise and wake up the inhabitants of the temple. Besides, the angry girl was very angry that the careless guy got all dirty while they were walking home. Therefore, the practical friend categorically ordered him to immediately take all the dirty clothes to the laundry room and wash himself as soon as possible. So, looking around cautiously like real spies, they quietly entered the unclosed door of the temple. Immediately after this, the hasty Minjona began to persistently push the hero into the house and impatiently ordered him to hurry up with the washing. However, unfortunately, although they were extremely quiet, the caring father was already patiently waiting for these two late children. The smart Minjona knew very well what her strict father would say if he saw the disheveled Genjin in such a terrible appearance. Therefore, the smart girl had no choice but to quickly push the guy into the room and quickly close the door. The man was very angry with his naughty daughter, who promised to come early, but was so late. Apparently, the guilty girl had to awkwardly lie that she was late because of extra classes, because they were punished at school, and she simply had no choice. However, for such an obvious lie, the smart daughter faced the suspicious gaze of her insightful father. But the stern man immediately melted under the awkward smile of his beloved daughter. So the kind father happily announced that he had specially prepared some delicious stewed ribs for his hard-working daughter. A caring man kindly invited a hungry girl to go out and eat before her food got too cold. He also called out loudly to Genjin, cordially inviting him to dine with them. However, the resourceful girl quickly lied that the tired Genjin would come to dine right after a refreshing shower. Hearing their loud shouts outside the door, an irritated Gusheon angrily covered his ears, completely not understanding why this couple was so loud and noisy. After this, the curious hero began to carefully examine the unfamiliar room in search of a shower. When the intrigued young man entered the bathroom, he quickly realized that in this strange world it was some kind of bathhouse. The puzzled guy tried to pull the taps, which he saw for the first time in his life. However, in the end, the confused hero simply doused himself with cold water. After this, the surprised schoolboy also saw a mirror, and for the first time was able to carefully look at the reflection of his new face. The young man really didn't believe that it was him, but the boy couldn't praise himself for his attractive appearance. However, the quick-witted hero quickly realized that the reflection in the mirror was very different from his previous appearance. The guy was no longer the powerful Gucheon he had been in his previous world. But instead of thinking about it painfully, the practical young man decided to first thoroughly wash off all this alien blood from himself. Then the hero was able to fully critically assess his skinny body in the reflection of the mirror. Just looking at himself made the proud guy feel disgusted, because he was completely unaccustomed to having such a weak body. A real man should be a man only by definition, because, as we know, every self-respecting man must carefully train his body in order to be called one with dignity. The hero was at least glad that hot water in this amazing world was always ready, and there was no need to ask the maids to heat it. After which a relaxed guy came into the room. The habitual young man went out naked, as he usually did in his past life, and completely forgot that the modest Minjona might be nearby. Therefore, as soon as the stunned hero saw the girl in her pajamas sitting behind the bed, he froze in fear, not understanding what she was doing there. At this awkward moment, the girl's father unexpectedly entered the room and immediately demanded that the impudent hero get out of here. The stern man, seeing the naked guy, immediately fell to the ground in fear, after which the shocked father screamed loudly, categorically ordering his innocent daughter to close her eyes immediately. After such an awkward situation, the ashamed hero was finally taken to his own room, where the confused young man was able to retire and meditate a little. However, no matter how much the embarrassed guy tried to calm down, he was still indignant that he had carelessly broken into his girlfriend's room without even warning her about it first. Trying to calm down, the thoughtful hero turned his restless thoughts to his last conversation with the wise teacher. The young man remembered his important words that the demonic cult does not exist in this world. The boy also remembered the mysterious words written on the scroll, and the promise that after successfully completing the final mission, he would be able to return home safely. The resolute hero hoped that the demon who had given him this solemn promise would honestly keep it. Otherwise, the enraged youth would find this scoundrel and tear him to pieces so that he would die in terrible agony. Somewhere around this time, a crowd of ghostly killers quickly ran across the rooftops of the Night City. No one believed that the mighty lord himself had personally called them to an emergency meeting. As is known, absolutely all the phantom killers responsible for the various districts left their important posts, because they were called to gather without exception. Apparently, the matter was very important and urgent. However, the young girl was only happy to see the phantom killers of other districts. The warrior was very excited, because they had not been gathered in one place so en masse for a long time. However, the sullen Doan clearly did not share her sincere enthusiasm, so he only sighed in displeasure. At that moment, the eldest of them immediately and sternly ordered everyone to shut up and concentrate. The guy didn't understand the general excitement of his subordinates, because the fact that they were all urgently summoned by the Lord himself indicated that something very important had happened. The fighters needed to remain extremely attentive. At this tense moment, the powerful Lord contacted all his loyal guys through special headphones, after which the influential leader asked them a couple of clarifying questions in order to make sure that the connection with his subordinates was in full order. The Lord rarely communicated with them directly and was even a little agitated by what was happening. The caring commander only hoped that all was well with his loyal subordinates, since he had come to them in order to conduct some reconnaissance. Then the serious Doen was convinced that the matter would turn out to be really serious, despite the fact that the Lord did not say so directly. As a result, the mighty Lord was silent for a short time, trying to collect his thoughts and say something important. After which the worried leader calmly explained that ominous traces of demonic arts had been discovered in their world. Around this time, the worried leader of Team 7 arrived at the main office. On the way, he was met by a kind secretary who helped the leader get to the 15th floor. Very soon, an agitated man stood outside the formidable director's office. The nervous visitor nervously adjusted his tie before knocking politely and asking permission to enter. As soon as the worried leader found himself in front of the influential director, he immediately bowed respectfully, patiently waiting for him to deign to pay attention to him. After a short silence, the busy director decided to find out how he could help the leader of the 7th team. The embarrassed man awkwardly explained that an unfortunate accident had occurred during one of the routine missions. However, it seemed that the indifferent director was not at all interested in what happened. The influential boss simply calmly asked the team leader to tell him if there was anything really worth his precious attention. However, the confused subordinate could not tell the director that teacher Park Chonam's student was involved in this matter. So the man just calmly explained that yesterday, while Team 2 was disposing of a corpse, they were accidentally discovered by the Phantom Killer. As a result, one killer and the members of Team 7 were involved in a brutal fight. Because of this, one of the fighters needed 11 weeks to recover, another 13 weeks, and the third lost his arm altogether. Obviously, someone who has lost a limb will no longer be able to continue his dangerous activity. However, the indifferent director was not at all interested in this sad information, which surprised the team leader quite a bit. His constantly surprised reaction had already begun to irritate the director himself. The influential boss was clearly interested in how long his male subordinate had been so uncomprehending. After which the calm director calmly reminded that there was no mention of their leader in the report of the 7th team. He joined only later. As you know, there are strict company norms. Sending participants without a leader even on a simple mission was a huge violation of these norms. The astute director understood perfectly well that if they started talking about this now, it would be a minus for the team. Therefore, the frightened man had no choice but to report what had happened to his superiors. They also had to present it as an accident involving a fall. So the practical director asked the leader of the 7th team to stop being so gloomy and making a mountain out of a molehill. All that was left for the leader to do was to obediently remain silent. After all, this place had always been a place where no one really cared about anything, especially pawns like them. From the management's point of view, the parts that were badly worn and broken simply needed to be replaced. The experienced man knew perfectly well that they were consumables. The indifferent director sent him away, and the subordinate merely bowed and hurried away. However, at the last moment the curious director stopped him. The boss was very interested in why the team leader disposed of the corpse without using the Golden Castle formation. As is known, all participants of the Phantom Department must be able to use the construction of the Golden Castle during work. This construction forms a space separated from reality. The lower ghost squads like them use talismans and mystical devices to form a formation. However, it was simply unthinkable for the members of the ghost squad to control it without taking any precautions. At that moment, the attentive director came closer and calmly explained to his subordinate that he had asked this question only out of idle curiosity. However, the leader of the 7th team looked very worried. It felt like something else had happened, but the subordinate was trying his best to hide it. But still, the indifferent boss decided not to delve into his soul, because all the little things were absolutely unimportant. The generous director even offered the leader a position in the 6th team, since he had been sitting in the weakest of them all for a long time. Surely the leader's meager salary was not enough to even pay for his children's education abroad. The director himself also did not have enough salary, although he spent it only on himself. The ambitious man also saw no point in getting stuck in one place, because people like him should quickly climb the career ladder, so that someone like the 7th leader could climb higher, because unlike ordinary people, he came from a prestigious family. Of course, the influential director understood that this might sound rude to the man, so he asked him not to be offended by these words. However, the strict boss categorically ordered that in this quarter the subordinate should not spoil his statistics and should be quieter. So after this tense conversation, the depressed man went up to the roof of the building to smoke. The upset leader didn't notice how he smoked his entire pack of cigarettes in one sitting. Pensively, he recalled all the events that happened last night. He finally came to his senses after the injury he received at the hands of Genjin. The leader didn't understand what happened after the boy attacked him. At that moment, the shocked commander saw a girl who was bandaging the wounds of her unconscious comrades. The apparently worried leader also ran up to them, trying to check on their condition. The alarmed man immediately ordered his subordinate to request backup and contact the medical team. However, when the girl did not budge, the angry leader decided that she was being too selfish. Only then did the worried commander notice that the girl had been crying non-stop the entire time. The desperate mercenary asked the team leader to keep his mouth shut about this student for their sake. The experienced man knew that if it had been anyone else, he would have scolded his subordinate for this nonsense. But the reason he chose this girl then was her phenomenal intuition. She could, thanks to this intuition, protect an entire team from collapse. Therefore, the wise leader was absolutely sure that she was not lying to him, and it would be better to do so. As the concerned commander found out, the boys were still breathing, but their condition was very bad. So the caring leader chose to take care of them first. The responsible man agreed to take the victims to a healer he knew, and they could discuss everything else later. After which, having dealt with the guys, they met again to discuss everything. The worried leader asked the girl for a long time about what had happened, but she still did not answer. So the leader felt guilty for sending the participants first. The self-critical man believed that he had not taken Park Chanam's students seriously, and therefore was a lousy leader, after which the carrying commander took a small box out of his bosom. Today was the devoted girl's birthday, so the kind leader decided to belatedly congratulate her, after which, finishing his last cigarette, the sad man took out a photograph that he always carried with him. It was a photograph with all the members of his team. The thoughtful leader remembered the words about how it was better to be alive, even if you had to live in poverty for the rest of your life. And he hoped that these guys were happy that they had managed to survive. He had no idea that someone who wanted to kill him was sneaking up on his back. Around this time, a new school day began. The lazy hero spent it again lounging on the school roof. The young man carefully examined the special assignment written on the scroll. For some reason, the completion percentage has gone up a lot, although yesterday it was at 30%. At that moment, the worried teacher also came up to the roof to see him. The best sword of Chanam decided to meet with the student in order to find out if he got home safely yesterday. The irritated Gusheon himself became angry when he saw him, because the guy had called the teacher in the morning, and he had only just deigned to come. However, the disgruntled teacher reminded that he had come immediately after the lesson had ended and wanted to know what the student had gotten himself into this time. The guilty schoolboy only laughed tensely, trying to hide the events of the previous night behind his laughter. But no matter how the cunning guy tried, the insightful teacher immediately realized that something bad had already happened. At the moment when the young man was hiding the truth, he decided to ask Park Chanam a couple of questions about the structure of this world. The curious schoolboy was particularly interested in whether there were anyone like hired killers in this world. As it turned out, they really were here. And there were also organizations that were supposed to fight them. For example, those people the boy met yesterday. Usually ordinary people called them shadows. Then the smart boy quickly realized that the Doen they met was some kind of policeman or a pawn in the government forces. However, what surprised Park Chanam was that the hero wanted to know where he could cross paths with them. The uncomprehending old man only rubbed his neck in confusion, lost in thought. Only then did the wise teacher realize that something must have happened to his problematic student if he was looking for the phantom killers. At that moment, the insightful hero realized that his teacher was completely unaware that the killers were continuing to follow him. And as if nothing had happened, the cunning guy turned his gaze from his teacher to the scroll flying in the air in front of him. Finally, looking at the progress, the young man realized that he had advanced after meeting those mercenaries who were chasing him. This made the hero smile happily, because finally, having found the connection, he would be able to complete this task and become even closer to returning home. After that, the attentive guy listened to his feelings. The hero felt many more opponents around his teacher. As is known, if a person has not reached the pinnacle of demonic arts, he can never hide from its sensations. Therefore, the smart young man quickly found his opponent and immediately began to ask why he was pursuing him. However, to his great shock, the confused schoolboy discovered a mercenary who did not understand anything. The disappointed boy sighed in displeasure. This man was clearly not one of those who had been following him yesterday. But Park Chanam was horrified by the mere sight of this man, not understanding what he was doing here. Around this time, the worried mercenary was walking home, holding the phone in her trembling hands. She had already called the team leader 13 times, but the leader had never answered her persistent calls. The girl was very worried about him, because the team was in complete chaos. Therefore, the worried mercenary asked to contact her as soon as the commander saw her text message. However, unexpectedly she received the long-awaited answer. The team leader apologized for not answering the calls and promised to write as soon as he finished the important work. Obviously, the confused girl immediately felt a huge relief. A heavy stone fell from her soul. Therefore, the calmed-down mercenary immediately reached for the door to open it and reunite with her younger brother and sister. However, suddenly the worried girl stopped dead in her tracks. A strange memory surfaced in her worried head. After all, the team leader said that it was better to call him, since the man hated answering written messages. And then suddenly the smart girl realized that the commander would never have written to her. A strange premonition gripped the anxious mercenary. She literally froze, looking anxiously at the doors where her beloved younger brother and sister should be. So the frightened girl immediately opened the door and rushed inside, desperately looking for the kids. However, fortunately, the children were alive and well, and joyfully ran up to greet their older sister. After which the younger ones also cheerfully told that a friend from her work came to visit the girl. The stranger brought a lot of tasty things, and the little ones left them for their sister. At that moment, the shocked mercenary froze in horror. However, the girl asked her sister and brother to go get ice cream. The caring elder gave them money, but asked them not to rush and cross the road carefully. After which, hiding her growing horror, the girl waited until the children left. Only then, turning her gaze to the calm stranger, did the mercenary ask him to introduce himself and explain how the man knew about this place. Because the unknown person was sitting in the dark, he was difficult to see. However, the girl felt with every fiber of her soul the ominous fighting spirit of the man in front of her. The mercenary felt mortal danger from him, so she took out a couple of smoke pills in time. Throwing them on the ground, the smart girl used this moment to quickly run away. Apparently, the frightened mercenary was worried that the Dark Squad had sent someone here because of what happened yesterday. The girl was afraid that her lie had been exposed. Or perhaps the worried girl was winding herself up because the leader had sent a suspicious message. However, at that moment, the unknown person pursuing her activated the construction of the golden chain manually. Not knowing about this, the confused mercenary looked around for talismans and mystical devices. However, the girl could say with certainty that there were no such things nearby. This means that the person who came to her was able to activate the formation directly. The stranger only explained to the mercenary with displeasure that he had hoped for a calm conversation. However, the girl seemed to be in a hurry to leave instead of chatting peacefully. After this, the man calmly leaned towards her and apologized for not introducing himself earlier. This man worked in the third team of the Dark Branch and was the leader of the team named So Juho. Apparently, the frightened girl thought that the commander had come here to deal with the surviving members of the 7th team. At this point, the man explained with a cold smile that, as is known, until he himself dispelled the golden chain, no one would be able to leave here. So Seo Juho suggested that she peacefully discuss what happened yesterday. According to the documents he received, his younger brother decided to take matters into his own hands and rushed into battle, but was left crippled when he fell. Only then did the shocked mercenary finally realize why Seo Juho had come for her. However, he did not wait for her answer and immediately pierced her leg with his small blade. Looking at her suffering, the ruthless man calmly explained that nothing could be hidden in the dark compartment. So the commander demanded that the girl tell what happened then. He had little time, so it was better to immediately tell the truth about what happened to his brother. However, at this critical moment, the mercenary heard a rather familiar loud voice. It was the hero who brought that spy of the dark department with him, and was glad that he managed to find the girl. After which, Gucheon explained with a satisfied smile that she should have followed him without delay. Not long before this, the spy brought the guy to the house where the mercenary lived, and politely asked Gucheon to let him go in return. However, the schoolboy then discovered that ahead was a formation of a golden chain with 8 gates. Obviously, the frightened spy was stunned when he heard these words. Gucheon himself looked around the formation with an interested smile, wondering who could use him so easily. The spy panicked. It couldn't be that someone sensed the formation. After all, even a real master couldn't sense it. This is precisely one of the reasons why even the head of the Phantom Killers could not find the dark department. The spy believed that such a brat would definitely not be able to detect him. But what a shock it was when the young man not only found him, but even began to break through the barrier. Looking at the formation, Gucheon only chuckled evilly, realizing that people who behave perfectly in public are always the dirtiest in reality. It was these vile types who created such a structure for themselves in order to hide from other eyes. As soon as the formation was broken, the spy immediately led the guy up to the upper floors. That's how they ended up here, finding the mercenary that Gucheon had been looking for all this time. Of course, the girl was amazed at how the guy got there. However, the schoolboy completely ignored the situation the girl found herself in, and tried to take her away. After all, the hero had several questions to ask. However, at that moment, the mercenary's leg cramped up badly. Then Gucheon saw that blood was flowing out of her. However, it seemed to the young man that the girl was only pretending to be in pain, because no one had ever died from such wounds. At that moment, Seo Juho grabbed the mercenary's hand and, looking at Gucheon, decided to find out how the guys managed to get here. The man thought that perhaps they had been inside the formation from the very beginning of its formation, although it was strange considering that he checked everything single-handedly. But before the commander had time to think about it, Gucheon freed the girl from his grip and immediately began to lead her away. The mercenary couldn't believe that this kid had caused so much trouble. Only after these words did the schoolboy pay attention to him and decided to find out what kind of man he was. Without waiting for an explanation from the hero, the man realized that the man who came also had business with his girlfriend. However, the boy came to visit her first, so, pointing his blade, Seo Juho politely advised Gucheon to be kind and let him talk. Not wanting to get involved in a pointless fight, the young man agreed with Seo Juho, allowing him to ask the necessary questions first. The man then turned his gaze back to the girl and explained that he needed answers about what happened to his brother. The mercenary immediately remembered the horror she had experienced at the moment when the hero had attacked her. So the girl had to admit that the reports this man received from the leader of their team were false. However, she had nothing to say about the third team leader's brother. In the evening, the entire team was attacked by an unknown enemy, and everyone was in danger. As for the identity of the enemy, he was wearing a mask, and they were unable to establish it. After listening to the report, Seo Juho decided to tell what the team leader taught him on his first day on the job. after which the man immediately stabbed the girl in the stomach with a knife. A life lesson from his commander was to trust no one, even if it was your teammate. Besides, since the girl was going to lie, she should at least learn to control her breathing. Because when a person lies, it is very easy to see through his deception. However, at that moment the man felt something oppressive presence. Apparently, this presence did not come from the guy sitting next to him. After that, someone else started approaching them from the other side of the corridor. The suitable teacher remembered the time when he left Jeonnam. Then he swore 1,000,000 times never to get involved in martial arts. The man didn't even want to breathe in the direction of this damned art. The closer Park Jeonnam got to Seo Juho, the more he realized that this person was the one who broke through his golden chain formation. Without answering his questions, the teacher just calmly pulled the sword from behind the wounded girl's back. After which, Jeonnam's best sword calmly looked at Seo Juho as if he were a dog that would never stop eating all sorts of crap. The teacher decided to teach the boy a lesson. After all, he was a former great swordsman. Although Park Jeonnam tried to look confident, his heart was beating faster than ever. This was because Jeonnam's status as the great sword had long since been over. At this moment, Guqin looked at the teacher with confusion, not understanding why he suddenly started to act so strangely. The teacher was even glad that the boy was probably worried about him. However, the schoolboy could feel his shortness of breath from a kilometer away. The thing is that this man was no longer the same great sword of Jeonnam, and this body began to slowly forget everything. However, the teacher knew that he had nothing to worry about, because his body, despite all the years, had not yet forgotten what a sword was. So Park Jeonnam immediately rushed at his opponent without even bothering to warn him about the attack. While fighting off his opponent's attacks, Seo Juho realized that his serve was quite good, but he could easily dodge such tricks. What the man didn't expect was that his opponent would suddenly decide to speed up, driving him into a dead end. Even the mercenary was surprised that this man had deliberately changed the speed of his sword to make the enemy lower his guard. The girl expected nothing less from the great swordsman Jeonnam. At that moment, lying on the ground, Seo Juho realized that things had clearly become more complicated. The commander was only supposed to subdue the enemy, but he found himself humiliated. And if that was the case, then he could not leave him alive. At this moment, while everyone was waiting for Seo Juho to attack, the spy even thought that perhaps Park Jeonnam had managed to kill him. However, Gucheon clearly felt that this was not the end of the battle, and at that moment, the leader of the third team stood up, armed with his small knife. When he was close enough to the enemy, Seo Juho used a deception technique, the Night Flower technique. This technique involved the man literally disappearing into the shadows, becoming invisible to his opponent. As a result, the commander crept up on the teacher from all sides, showering his body with small but deep bleeding wounds. The mercenary couldn't believe that Seo Juho was dangerous even for the great swordsman. At this moment, Gucheon did not share her fear. The schoolboy just calmly decided to ask the girl where he could find her boss. Obviously, the mercenary could not answer such stupid questions when the person who stood up for her could die. But the hero immediately grabbed the girl by the face and demanded that she not be distracted by these fighting boys. Of course, the mercenary was amazed at how this guy, even being a scumbag, could treat his own teacher like that. And the schoolboy seemed to sense that she had just almost cursed him in her thoughts. But the young man asked her not to worry, because he knew his teacher very well. He definitely would not lose. As is known, there are 4 secrets of the art of the sword. They were weight, dullness, speed, and illusion. Blunting is the art of controlling space with a slow sword. The weight is meant to add heaviness to the weapon and improve the power of your swing. Speed is needed to make the sword nimble and precise. And finally, with illusion, you can outsmart your opponent. And also find a way to take advantage of the opportunity to make a stealth attack. Usually, once you master at least one of these secrets, you will never lose again. However, on the other hand, if a master does not master any of them, his mastery cannot be called as such. For this reason, the hero knew that Park Jeonnam would never lose. So the schoolboy politely asked the mercenary to focus only on him and answer his questions. Looking at the hero, the girl realized that perhaps he could help their team. The embarrassed mercenary explained that she was merely a low-level member of the Dark Squad. Typically, the team leader receives instructions from those above them and passes them on to them. They are not privy to the details, they simply do the job. The hero was obviously wondering where their leader had gone. However, only the fighting Seo Juho could know. The man was from the 3rd team of the Dark Section, much higher than their 7th team. And the hero was angry that the girl decided to tell only now? Obviously, since Seo Juho was above the mercenary leader, he probably knew more than her boss. And if this is so, then this person is exactly the one he needs. At that moment, the teacher began to have difficulty breathing. He managed to fight back, but his body was badly injured. Even Seo Juho found it hard to believe that he had found the person who had dodged his sword dance. But even so, the man has lost too much blood and will soon lose consciousness. But the teacher pulled himself together with his last strength. No matter how beaten he was, He couldn't lose to such a shameful dog. It was only at this moment that the observers noticed that Gushan had disappeared somewhere. At that moment, the schoolboy found himself between two opponents. Both the teacher and Seo Juho were surprised. Who was this boy, since he appeared so unnoticed between them? So, with a quick smile, Gushan reminded his teacher that time is money. So the hero suggested that the teacher have a good rest and regain his strength. Having hit him in the face, the young man immediately knocked the man out. The teacher flew away and lost consciousness. A little rest wouldn't hurt him. Apparently, no one understood the schoolboy's motives and thought that the guy was truly crazy. But the hero, as if nothing had happened, simply calmly picked up his master's blade, after which the young man calmly turned to his enemy with the most indifferent look. But soon his demonic nature came out when he decided to ask Seo Juho a few questions with a creepy smile. Apparently, Seo Juho couldn't believe that Gucheon had just attacked his teacher. However, the schoolboy loudly interrupted him and reminded him that the fact that they came together did not mean that they were working together. And Seo Juho got furious at such disrespect, so he immediately attacked the guy with his knife. However, the hero easily stopped the attack of the idiot rushing towards him with one hand. After which, the young man calmly explained what he was grateful for. He felt better precisely after taking her pills. Perhaps it was because his body was very weak. Apparently, the girl couldn't believe that he had taken a whole box full of these pills at once. However, the hero only laughed and reminded that such things were not even good for him as a snack. But at once they were able to help him. After which, attacking the guy in the shoulder, the schoolboy forced him to fall to his knees in front of him. Gushion hoped that at least now he would answer his questions and stop doing stupid things. Seeing Seo Juho coughing up blood, the hero wanted to know where the boss of the dark branch they were talking about was. At this tense moment, Seo Juho glared at the guy and sharply demanded that his wrist be released. Gucheon obeyed, secretly hoping for a frank conversation. But then he grabbed the opponent's hand tightly again. The young man coldly reminded him that the man had treated him with extreme disrespect, and that such a tone of communication was unacceptable. The spy, watching this madness, asked in bewilderment who this strange guy was. Meanwhile, Gucheon explained to Seo Juho with a devilish grin that he would never grovel before someone like him. The girl was finally convinced that they had no idea who they were dealing with. At this time, fighters from the third team were waiting near the building, but they could not get through to their leader. All his gear and uniform were still with them. The comrades had no choice but to report the incident and urgently request reinforcements. They felt that their commander's plans had clearly failed, since he had remained silent for so long. At that moment, the hero watched as Seo Juho's confidence gradually dissipated, and the man backed away in fear. Looking at him, Gucheon only grinned. The guy really was quite strong. However, the enemy was filled with self-confidence. He considered the hero an ordinary newbie who lacked combat experience, while he himself, being the leader of the third squad, had already merged with his blade into one. Hearing this statement, Gucheon froze in amazement. Was it really true? The young man decided to check whether this guy had really reached his limit, or was just talking empty words. Seo Juho has already started using the technique of merging an object and a person. The aura emanating from him sent the spy and the mercenary flying to the sides. Never before had they felt such a terrifying fighting spirit. However, Gucheon was not at all afraid. He just patiently waited for Seo Juho to show his true abilities. The man was sure that this puppy would never escape. Even if he wanted to, it would be too late. The boy only gripped the handle of the blade tighter. He liked the adrenaline rush when the blood boiled in his veins. Seeing his determination, Seo Juho agreed to answer all the questions if the hero was defeated. However, the guy was clearly indignant. Why can't he answer right now? At that moment, both opponents jumped up and rushed forward with their blades drawn. When they collided, Seo Juho even panicked for a moment, while Gucheon was really excited. However, both of them noticed how, under the pressure of the enemy's dagger, the heavenly demon's blade began to crack. The guy had no choice but to step back so that the weapon wouldn't fall apart. The next moment, the two continued to exchange precise blows. Now one would go on the offensive, now the other. However, when all attacks failed, Seo Juho realized that the fight would not be easy. He decided to show the enemy what it was like to have the Nightflower deception technique used against him. Immediately, a multitude of precise attacks flew towards the boy, during which all his weapons shattered into tiny fragments. There was nothing left to defend himself with. Then Seo Juho realized how stupid the student in front of him was. Now victory will definitely go to him. He grinned, looking at the defenselessness of his enemy, and was already celebrating his triumph. But at that moment he felt an energy that began to push him back. This power came from Gucheon, who decided to show his technique to the enemy in return. This technique had no specific form, but it could completely absorb the enemy. The name of the technique is the Black Void technique. Everything was covered in darkness. Those around could only hear the drops of blood slowly dripping down, but they could see nothing. They tried to figure out who lost and who won. It turned out that Seo Juho remained unharmed. However, he was scared. The man was sure that he was aiming, and when his blade broke, it should have hit his opponent straight in the head. However, in the end, his move only caused him a small scratch. Still, he could admit that Gu Cheon's technique was fast, although it lacked substance. The guy just laughed. After all, he was still holding back while using this technique. Only then did Seo Juho notice the huge wound adorning his stomach. He didn't even realize when the enemy had managed to attack him. At that moment, the hero just laughed at his frightened expression and explained that there was no need to be afraid. Death would come within the next couple of hours. And now, as promised, he should open his mouth and answer questions. But the man had no intention of listening to such a sucker. At that moment, under his influence, the formation of the golden chain began to break. The others inside noticed this too. The next moment, when the hero opened his eyes, he noticed that he was already surrounded by the phantom assassins. The guy looked back at them, not understanding why all the blades were pointed at him. Then Seo Juho explained that the boy literally oozed an ominous fighting spirit. In this situation, he looked like a real victim. After all, he was almost killed, although he was just innocently walking by. Only at that moment did the hero realize that this idiot had slightly outplayed him. At this moment, Doan carefully looked at the boy's face. Looking back, he quickly discovered his teacher, who was unconscious. Obviously, he didn't understand what the boy was doing, since they found him in such a disadvantageous position. At that moment, one of the phantom assassins loudly announced that the hero had violated the laws of the Murim Union by using martial arts against the law. However, Gu Qian immediately ordered the boy to be silent. After all, for the first time he remembered that it was forbidden to violate the laws of sacredness and the like. The phantom killers had no choice but to loudly declare that everyone present here would be arrested. Naturally, as the first time, they were warned that the Union would judge. Apparently everyone looked very excited, especially the spy, who had nothing to do with it at all and was there by chance. However, Gu Qian only became angry that he was once again being threatened with some kind of alliance. After which he reminded him that if he didn't want to go there, they wouldn't be able to bring him there by force. Only then did the phantom assassins realize that this boy was indeed the notorious disciple of Park Jong-nam. Even Doon asked him to shut up. The situation was completely different from last time. However, after asking to stop such useless chatter, Gu Cheon repeated his question. He wanted to know what these pathetic humans could do to him. After his words, everyone around felt a truly disgusting pressure. But a man appeared out of nowhere and explained that if a criminal refuses to follow the instructions of the phantom killers, he must be killed. This answer is well known to all people, unless they were the most complete idiots. Looking at the approaching man, everyone was speechless. After all, it was the captain of the phantom assassins. That same Lord and Master Damro. Even the phantom assassins were surprised that Mr. Damro decided to show up in person. Everyone thought he was in China. And as it turned out, the man had just returned from there. However, he was upset. As soon as he returned, his subordinates prepared such a surprise for him. Doyon advised the hero to simply keep quiet, at least for the sake of his master Park Chonam. Only then did the boy from the phantom assassins realize that the peacefully sleeping, beaten man was the very same first sword of Jonam. They were clearly impressed by the fact that he looked like a very ordinary old man. After all, according to the stories of his elders, he should have been completely different. At that moment, Mr. Damro approached the hero as if nothing had happened. Their eyes met with curious glances, and unexpectedly for himself, Gushan decided to obey. He promised to give them just an hour. During that time, he would cooperate as much as possible. That's how all four of them ended up in the Union's sights. At this time, a spy was being interrogated. According to his story, he was captured by a boy named Genjin and brought here. Apparently, the man couldn't believe that the phantom assassins didn't believe him. Considering that they had seen Genjin, he had a scary appearance and a gangster name. But it was hard to believe that some schoolboy managed to drag a grown man against his will. After this, interrogations of the hero himself began. He immediately claimed that he was attacked by the killers of the Dark Department, and that was exactly how it happened. So he insisted that he was the real victim. His teacher had told them more than once not to use martial arts in vain, warned them over and over again. However, he couldn't stand to see someone trying to kill his teacher, so he couldn't turn a blind eye to it. The phantom killer conducting the interrogation realized that the rumors that this boy was crazy were not a lie. However, it was possible that a dark branch was behind the attack. Then perhaps they really were trying to kill Park Jongnam, although their motives remained unclear. At that moment, the phantom killers looked at the boy who was crying, telling how bad people tried to kill his poor teacher. Even though he had been yelling at them and resisting just an hour ago, his breathing was now even, indicating that he was not lying. At that moment, Damro was watching the boy's interrogation, wondering if the dark branch and the demonic cult were connected. However, at that moment, the hero looked straight into his eyes. It was impossible for them to meet each other's eyes in this specially equipped room. But the next moment, When he looked at the boy, he had already looked away. So Damro had no choice but to try to write off this misunderstanding as a coincidence. Soon the interrogation of teacher Park Chanam also began. He tried to pretend that he was sleeping. However, Do-young clearly saw that he was peeping the whole time, so he asked the teacher to stop fooling around. Then the old man laughed as if nothing had happened, noting that he and Don had been crossing paths quite often lately. It was precisely for this reason that Do-young believed that what Park Jung-nam was doing was personal revenge against the cultists. As you know, he left everything behind him. So Do-en, who was also abandoned by a man as a child, was left wondering why he was trying to re-enter the world of martial arts. The teacher was silent for a long time. He was well aware that Do-en hated him. However, he asked the boy to control his emotions and think coolly and rationally. It seems he was not taught this while he was in Jeonnam. Moreover, the teacher felt that the Cheonam sect had probably assigned the Dark Branch to monitor him. His student also came across these people, and their situation worsened due to the surveillance they were undergoing. Considering that the Phantom Assassins were part of the Union, the teacher felt that Do-en should thoroughly investigate the conspiracy of the Dark Department and the cult. At that very moment, Do-en jumped up as if scalded. The ground beneath his feet shook, as if a sleeping giant had awakened. The guy frantically grabbed the intercom, desperately trying to get through to Mr. Damro and find out the reason for the chaos. The Lord calmly explained that a youth from the damned demonic order had staged a real riot. Now he has brazenly captured one of their warriors. This news left everyone present in complete shock. Do-young was seething with rage, but Park Jung-nam sharply told him to pull himself together and maintain his composure. Although the mentor himself was at a loss to understand why this little brat was constantly losing his mind. The captured warrior screamed at the top of his lungs, furiously demanding that the scoundrel immediately remove his dirty paws from him. But Gucheon only shouted louder in response, sarcastically reminding them that law enforcement officers were obliged to keep their word. This insolence only enraged the fighter even more. All this time he had felt pity for Gucheon solely because of his young age. Only now did the warrior realize the true power of the brat. A simple touch of his foot and a grab of his wrist, and his body seemed to turn to stone, refusing to obey his will. Do-yeon and Park Jung-nam burst into the room. The ghost immediately turned to the little creature, who clearly did not understand the scale of what had happened. The mentor almost lost consciousness from horror, prayerfully begging Genjin to tell the truth and free them all. But Gucheon only grunted with displeasure. He gave them a whole hour, and these blockheads wasted precious time on empty chatter. Finally exasperated, Don angrily ordered the scoundrel to stop this behavior. Otherwise, after counting to 3, he would simply finish off the impudent fellow. Only Damro maintained his Olympian calm, gently suggesting to everyone in the room to cool down and have a civilized conversation. When Do-in tried to rush into the attack, the Overlord immediately stopped him, knowing full well that a fight would not lead to anything good. Then Gucheon calmly remarked that if he had been listened to from the very beginning, no one would have had to be forced. Besides, he was especially annoyed by this Do-en, who was shouting something there, cowardly hiding behind the boss's back and yapping under the cover of his authority. In the hero's opinion, such a person was a real pathetic loser. These words couldn't help but infuriate the ghost warrior to the point of white heat. The two opponents began to incinerate each other with furious glances, ready to tear each other's throats out at any moment. Park Chanam could barely stand on his buckling legs from nervous exhaustion. He no longer understood where he was and who all these formidable people were, surrounding him in a tight ring. Suddenly, the sharp clap of the Lord's hands echoed throughout the room, demanding that everyone immediately calm down and stop squabbling. He took full responsibility for Gucheon's antics and decided to let the young man go. But first, he had to free his captive. The hero did not understand why he should trust the man who lured him here and locked him within 4 walls. The angry lord only reminded the boy that it was better to immediately move away from his comrade. If the villain is unwilling to cooperate while he tries to resolve the conflict peacefully, then he will have to act with harsh methods. At the same moment, the man moved lightning fast towards the youth and fixed a threatening gaze on him. The young man felt no fear at all. He just pushed the decrepit hand away with annoyance and stood up. The captured warrior immediately collapsed without strength. His partner immediately flew up and pulled his comrade up, hurrying to get him to the medical unit for an examination of his injuries. Only now did the guy cast an angry glance at Damro, sarcastically noting that he would have to pay for every word he said. The commander had no intention of denying it, so he gently told the schoolboy to throw his worries out of his head. A real hurricane of events was raging around them. But now, free from prying ears, they could have a frank conversation. Moreover, this dialogue also touched upon the former great warrior Jeonnam. Finally, the Lord got the opportunity to talk to Park Chanam face to face. They had not seen each other for a good eternity. It felt like a whole decade had passed since their last meeting. The old men began to chat about trivialities, which inevitably irritated the hero. Therefore, he bitterly advised the old men to leave the memories for later and to deal with specific issues. Instantly, all the video surveillance systems in the room went out, shielding their dialogue from unwanted witnesses. Only after this did Damro reveal that they had already figured out the essence of what had happened. It turned out that the female fighter was constantly communicating with the mercenary, who begged her to tell the whole truth without concealment. After all, they were responsible for maintaining peace here, and were willing to lend a helping hand. The ruler even gave his word that if the girl provided assistance, they would settle everything quietly, so that she would not be in any danger. It was her testimony that confirmed that the opponents of Gucheon and Park Jeonnam actually belonged to the shadow branch of the Jeonnam sect. Of course, Park Jeonnam had absolutely no idea why this organization had any connection with the cult he was from. And what exactly was this gang? However, Damro explained that we are talking about individuals who prefer to operate from behind the scenes. The Overlord himself clumsily explained that the design of the golden shackles originally served to restrict movement, but the Shadow Wing had redesigned it to mask its activities and plans, to deal with the unwanted in a dimension isolated from reality. This technology has been undermining the existing foundations for a long time, but no solution has been found yet. Naturally, Park Jeonnam was amazed. If even Damro was powerless against this structure, then how could some kid manage to hack it? Of course, Gucheon immediately realized that the commander was most concerned with the method by which he had solved it. The boy calmly explained that only a true master of martial arts could do such a thing, and that it could not be learned without the appropriate level of skill. Unless a person is incredibly lucky, then he will be born with an innate gift. After this, the Lord calmly admitted that he had expected exactly this kind of answer from the hero. But suddenly the boy interrupted him. It seemed that he had already guessed what proposal Damro intended to make to him. It looked as if the Lord planned to use this design to catch dangerous villains. However, the youth coldly noted that no matter how much Damro surpassed the Shadow Wing adepts, he was still unable to decipher this technology. Therefore, the art itself remained completely inaccessible to him. However, all these details did not bother the man at all. He was interested in whether Gucheon would agree to provide support. Hearing these words, the tiny imp only grinned. He hoped that now the Lord would not act according to the hackneyed pattern and would not try to use him for the promise of liberation. After all, it would be simply absurd, considering that he is capable of slipping away from here without outside help. Having heard such insolence, the teacher froze like a pillar, not believing that the student was so brazenly communicating with such a powerful person. And Damro immediately realized that it was really worth negotiating with the boy peacefully. So he decided to fulfill his wish. The hero's first demand was that from now on the Ghost Warriors would not interfere in his affairs. The second object of his interest was this loser Doan. The guy would like to beat him half to death. At this point, it wasn't just Doan. Absolutely everyone was petrified by the impudence of this tiny monster. However, the boy was suddenly distracted, noticing a scroll materializing before his eyes. He was given 3 seconds to join with Mr. Damro and continue searching for the demonic order. Refusal meant death. However, the hero was in no hurry, listening intently to Damro's speech. He couldn't accept the second condition, but he promised that as long as the boy didn't touch the Ghost Warriors, they would support him in any endeavor. At the very moment he said this, the hero's allotted seconds expired. Therefore, he immediately accepted the proposed conditions. So he agreed to a key plot mission. True, he was very worried about it, because he was hanging by a hair from death. Meanwhile, the director of the Shadow Wing came to his boss. As soon as he crossed the threshold, an ashtray was thrown at him at full speed. The boss screamed hysterically. After all, he had repeatedly warned his subordinate not to let the phantom scoundrels get on their trail. He even stole the clan's classified documents and designed new protection for them. That's why he was so furious, not understanding what the hell his staff was doing. He only calmly explained that evidence of the use of Golden Shackles technology had been discovered. However, the entire story with the Ghost Warriors and the commander of the 3rd Squad was now being studied by the elite brigade of the Shadow Wing. But the chief continued to yell, not understanding how Damro had ended up in Korea in the first place. He was not informed that he had escaped persecution. Soon the enraged man tried to pull himself together and cool down. Still angry, he ordered the people who were currently watching Damro to be immediately recalled. The guy also had to make sure that everything went quietly and deal with any unwanted witnesses if necessary. In order to conceal evidence, he could be unashamed with either his opponents or his allies. The main thing is to wipe from the face of the earth everything and everyone who can lead to them. The subordinate merely calmly assured the master that, as usual, he would do the job flawlessly. A little later, the hero and company were finally heading home. Only the teacher grumbled, wondering how he had ever come to such an existence and such troubles. Naturally, the hero tried to console his mentor. In the end, everything turned out quite well. At that moment, relieving the tension, the mercenary spoke up, expressing gratitude to everyone for saving them. Without this couple, neither she nor her family would have survived. Both men turned away awkwardly, unaccustomed to being thanked for their actions. Only then did the man notice that the girl's injuries were still bleeding. However, it turned out that the pain had already retreated, and the girl clearly thanked the great warrior Gucheon for her salvation, who supported her in the fight. Naturally, the guy was seething. After all, thanks to the fact that Park Chanam introduced himself as his mentor, now everyone calls him by the same title. And the man himself, it seemed, was only jubilant that his protege had finally gained respect, at least in someone's eyes. Even the spy chuckled, glad that today's tension had finally dissipated. None of them suspected that the ghost warrior Doen, who himself was disgusted by such surveillance, was spying on them from behind cover. He recalled that the boss had recently gathered everyone to announce new rules. According to his orders, the ghost warriors were to cooperate with Gucheon until the final defeat of the Shadow Wing. No one objected to working with teacher Park Chanam. After all, he was a great man. But no one wanted to mess with his crazy student. Even Do Young claimed that Gucheon was a real idiot, and that they wouldn't be able to get anything done. Damro could only assure that he would certainly look after this boy. Of course, he realized that this would add to his worries. But in order to make life easier for his subordinates, he promised to make every effort. Then he reminded the boys that they were all ghost warriors, and their purpose was to pacify troublemakers and maintain balance. It was a great opportunity for them. Gucheon should have been used to study the method of opening the structure of the golden shackles. As soon as he reminded all his subordinates of the importance of their task, everyone immediately agreed to deal with even Satan himself. And Gucheon was very similar to him. Damro then decided to inform them of the group nature of the upcoming operations. Doyeon was to act in tandem with the former great warrior Park Jungnam. Suyun will go with the guys from the 7th group, specifically with that spy guy and the mercenary Yusona. And the remaining guy will accompany their problematic student Genjin. They should have used this chance to eradicate evil from its roots. Meanwhile, Genjin was still waiting on the territory of Minjong's house. She couldn't wait for him, and finally saw his figure climbing the steps to the house. However, the joy turned to irritation when she ran up to the guy and reproached him for completely forgetting his promise to return for dinner. While she was waiting for him, she almost died of hunger. Gucheon even considered simply knocking the girl out and avoiding having to justify himself. But he decided to be kind and lied that the teacher had asked him to stay a little longer. Realizing that the guy couldn't do anything about the circumstances, Minjona immediately grabbed his hand and dragged him into the dining room. But as soon as he entered the kitchen, he immediately received several slaps on the head from the head of the family for the fact that the hero attacked the food in such an ill-mannered manner. That night was particularly disturbing. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, giant lightning bolts flashed across the entire sky above the hospital. It was in this hospital that Seo Juho was recovering from severe injuries. Finally, he woke up. But the first thing he heard was the speech of an unknown man. He was already on duty at the bedside, waiting for the patient to wake up. Then he calmly explained that it was nothing personal. He had simply received an order to eliminate him. However, Seo Juho had one last request. A message had to be delivered to a certain person. Of course, the killer tried to explain to the former commander of the 3rd Squad that even if he delivered the message, nothing would change from his frivolous speeches. Seo Juho calmly explained that killing one person like him would not solve the problem. Moreover, he was convinced that once his letter was read, even the director would have no alternative but to use their secret weapon. After a long night, Yusona left the hospital in the morning, where she had gone to get serious cuts treated and stitched up. But suddenly she saw her comrade in front of her. She was obviously stunned to find that the boy had regained consciousness. The girl grabbed him by the wrists, making sure that his body was not injured and that nothing was causing pain. Then she cried with relief, because she was sincerely overjoyed that he had survived and was healthy. However, she was puzzled as to what he was doing there. It seemed to her that after such injuries, he was contraindicated to move so actively. But suddenly, looking up, she saw the evil, icy gaze of her comrade. Trying to change the subject, the girl decided to find out whether her comrade had spoken with the team commander. For some reason, he didn't pick up the phone. He just sent a message and then disappeared. The guy immediately decided that his girlfriend just wanted to make fun of him. She must have understood perfectly well why the team commander's cell phone was silent. Plus, even the report on the incident in which he died was compiled incorrectly. So he wanted to find out what Yusona had been doing as the only one who had remained unharmed all this time. The girl immediately rushed to explain that many events had happened to her, and as a result of these adventures, she had united with the Ghost Warriors. And not only with them, but even with the student and the best sword of Chanam, whom they met then. They promised to help them and even wanted to take the blame for the team leader. However, the guy just laughed at her words. He was sure that his friend had lost her mind, or that there had been some misunderstanding. It turned out that not long before, while he was in the hospital, the guys came to him and told him that the commander of the 7th team and member Yu Sung had betrayed the Shadow Wing. The guy thought it was some kind of confusion, Naturally, he wanted to sort it all out personally and asked not to rush to conclusions. It seemed to him that the girl was the only one from their team who would never betray them, and all because they really were a team and sincerely valued each other. The Phantom Warrior watched their conversation closely, keeping an eye on the situation. However, she felt quite uneasy. She didn't understand who this guy was hanging around Yusona and why he was hanging around for so long. The girl didn't even notice how at that moment a gang of thugs snuck up on her from behind. At that moment, Yusona's former comrade threw a knife at her and ordered the girl to commit suicide. This was the final mercy he could grant her. Otherwise, he would kill her with particular ferocity. Meanwhile, Damro visited his part-time mentor, the head of the Shadow Squad. He poured the boy some tea, wondering why the student, who had been absent from Korea for so long, had not immediately come to visit his teacher. After accepting a cup of tea, Damro asked the teacher not to hold a grudge. Then he explained with a smile that he had indeed accumulated a lot of things to do since his arrival. He was well aware that his mentor was a busy man, so he came here to find out why there was such chaos around. The man couldn't help but laugh, realizing that the older he got, the more often he immersed himself in memories. He remembered the time when Damro left him and decided to join the martial arts union. At that time, he had no idea how much this hurt his elderly mentor. However, now he did not feel that regret at all. After all, the child he personally raised became one of the strongest fighters in the union. With a smile on his face, he admitted that he was very proud of his students' achievements. Naturally, Damro was extremely flattered to hear such praise. However, at that moment his phone vibrated alarmingly, so the guy smiled and apologized for having to step away and take the call. He immediately picked up the phone and asked his subordinate to report on the situation, and in case of a non-urgent question, not to disturb him. However, as the conversation progressed, he quickly realized that circumstances required his participation. He was informed that the suspect, Seo Juho, had disappeared from the hospital. Naturally, he immediately glanced at his mentor, guessing his involvement. Meanwhile, Genjin was attending physical education class. A classmate passed him the ball very aggressively, but the boy caught it without any difficulty. Then he decided to make exactly the same pitch to Doen, who was pretending to be a schoolboy in order to observe him. However, even despite the power of the serve, he easily intercepted the ball. Classmates shouted loudly in support of these two. The only gloomy person was Doen, who didn't understand what these two idiots were even doing. But suddenly, when Hoenn made a counter-throw, they all felt an unusual fluctuation in the energy field, reminiscent of the Golden Shackles technology. Even the ball flying towards the hero suddenly froze and smoothly fell to the ground. At that moment, absolutely everyone noticed that it suddenly became dark outside, as if before a thunderstorm. Other teachers started talking about this, and Park Chonam, who heard this, clearly became nervous at this time. The school children began to discuss the sudden darkening. They even thought that it might be nice to sleep, so it even attracted them. However, upon hearing these conversations, the Ghost Warriors immediately understood what was being discussed. But even they found it hard to believe that the Shadow Wing members actually dared to attack them and fight right on school grounds. Suddenly, the guys turned on the camera on their cell phones and saw a guy sitting right on the basketball hoop. At that moment, the most powerful killers of the entire Shadow organization began to penetrate them through the spatial portal. However, no matter how hard the guys tried to film these strange people, for some reason the phone camera categorically refused to turn on. And soon Doen noticed some kind of fog spreading throughout the room. It seemed to be some kind of sleeping gas, because absolutely everyone who inhaled it had already collapsed unconscious. Luckily, Hoenn quickly checked the children and found that they had simply fallen asleep. It seems that the creatures that came to them deliberately did not kill the children. They wanted to take civilians hostage. At this moment, Mingiona also felt tired. Therefore, the hero carefully picked up the girl in his arms. He was clearly annoyed that once again someone was interfering in his normal, peaceful life. Park Chonam, meanwhile, was rushing to the gym at full speed to find out what was happening with the children who were in class. But suddenly an old man appeared right in front of him and asked the hurrying scoundrel to stay a little longer. At this moment, the head of the Shadow organization calmly called the student over to continue drinking tea. And Damro, with the kindest smile, explained that he didn't even know what to do. He really wanted to have tea with the teacher, but something urgent had come up. He had to go, and this teacher knew perfectly well that if Damro was in a hurry, something very important must have happened. However, he honestly admitted that he hoped that he would settle his case as soon as possible. At that moment, the hero, standing in the middle of the hall, felt the familiar aura of a man he had already met in battle. As it turned out, it was Seo Juho in front of him, who literally rose from the dead to carry out his final order. Park Chonam looked at the old man. He knew this man very well, smiling smugly at him. Besides, he immediately realized that since the old man was here, it meant that he was probably connected with the construction of the Golden Chain. This old man was his own teacher, who once introduced him to martial arts. The teacher remembered that it had been 10 years since he had been expelled from Jeonnam and had become a mercenary. However, this news did not surprise Park Chanam much, because the teacher had not changed at all since those long ago times. It was no surprise. Even after all these years, he was still himself. He loved drinking, gambling, and money, and he loved the free life. However, looking at his student, he could not help but notice that he had changed very much, and not to say for the better. He wanted to know what it was like for a former student to become a teacher himself, and was it worth it? And then memories of his crazy student flashed before the man's eyes. He could only say that he did everything in his power to help him. The old man just sighed heavily. He remembered his time as a teacher and how he could barely cope with one student. And the man only reminded him with displeasure that it was precisely for this reason that the man was expelled from the Cheonnam clan. However, these words only made him laugh, although the student was not at all mistaken. It was very close to the truth, but at the same time he understood that if he had not met that woman in the old days, things would have been much better. However, not wanting to delay any longer, he preemptively attacked his former student, letting him know that he was serious, and with an angry expression on his face ordered him to immediately draw his sword. Now behind the old man was a student of Park Chanam himself. This meant that the former best sword had to fulfill his duty as a teacher, and the old man would fulfill his duty as a mercenary, after which they both drew their blades. The old man remembered that when Park Chanam left Cheonnam, he stopped being a martial artist. I even began to worry that Park Chanam had forgotten how to fight properly, and would die quickly in battle. Park Jongnam was clearly irritated by the old man's chattering so much, but the man just laughed and attacked, explaining that when Park Chanam gets older, he will understand that with age a person becomes even more talkative. At that moment, the phantom killers tried to put all the children next to each other. Since there was nowhere to evacuate them, the best they could do was at least gather them in one place to make it easier to protect, after which they agreed to go to help as quickly as possible. After all, they felt very well that there were murderers outside. They decided to send Doan for help. Hon would stay here to protect the kids. Besides, he had Gucheon as his backup, and with him they would definitely be able to somehow deal with the attackers. At that moment, the arriving mercenaries noticed that their opponent was one of the phantom assassins. Obviously, such a person could cause them problems. Even the big guy panicked, because when they were given the task, nothing like this was discussed. Only now did he understand why the price for this order was so suspiciously high. However, the girl who came with him was not upset at all. She was happy with the big money and was ready to pay a high price for it. The very thought of fighting the phantom assassins made her excited. At that moment, while they were talking, Doan had already disappeared. Now only Hoen, the phantom assassin, remained against them. However, suddenly they noticed a young man who was still standing on his feet. The fat man immediately approached the child, not understanding why the gas was literally useless against him. So he calmly explained to the little boy that he didn't understand the situation he was in. He'd be better off going and lying down with everyone else. However, the hero did not respond to his words, which greatly infuriated the big guy. He had no other choice, so he decided to put him to bed himself. Hoen, however, froze in fear in this tension. Looking at the hero, he absolutely did not understand why Gucheon was always smiling with such a frightening expression on his face. At that moment, giggling, the hero thanked those who had come for preparing everything for him, and calmly told about the times when he was the strongest. Now he was imprisoned in the body more weakly than before, but now he knew he was going to get even stronger and he wanted to have fun with his new toys again. As soon as he grabbed the big guy's hand, it literally went numb, and the man himself pulled away, not believing that some child could have so much strength. The man didn't have time to do anything before the boy already attacked him. It seemed as if he could punch through the man's entire fat layer with one fist and grab him by the liver. Realizing this, he turned pale with fear. The only thing that saved him was the arrival of the leader of the third group, who blocked it with his blade. After which he calmly warned the other mercenaries who had come that it was better to simply act against this boy instead of 1,000 words. You literally couldn't let your guard down against him because he was just a real madman. It was for this very reason that their mission today was not the phantom assassins at all, but this much more dangerous guy. At this point, Gucheon was already indignant, not understanding why such useless idiots were opposing him. He decided to refrain from long introductions and immediately see if they could have fun. At this moment, he had a new mission. He had to destroy all the assassin squads, and as a reward, he would receive an entrance ticket to the demonic sphere hideout or secret sphere hideout. The duel between Park Cheonnam and his own mentor continued. However, the old man immediately noticed that his protege was overly concerned with covering his own skin. At this rate, he will never get to his pupil on time. Plus, if a fighter can't handle even a decrepit old man, then he is not worthy of the title of Great Warrior. Of course, such words could not help but infuriate Park Cheonnam to the point of white heat. However, even watching his rage, the mentor realized the truth of his own words. The guy should have taken an honest look at himself. He swore he would never get involved with martial artists again, and he was absolutely convinced of it. However, in reality, he turned out to be nothing more than an arrogant fool who believed his own lies. Park Chan-nam reminded him with displeasure that his aspirations could not be considered as some kind of arrogance. The old man sighed calmly, wondering why his pupil continued to argue with him forever. It was at this point that his indulgence in memory of old times ran out. Therefore, calmly pointing his blade at his opponent, he explained that if things continued like this, then today Park Chan-nam would die at his hand. The man was furious that his mentor was talking such nonsense. It seemed that he was drunk, since he was so self-confident. Enraged by these speeches, the warrior attacked his pathetic, foolish former student. At that moment, all the killers were dumbfounded in front of Gucheon. Looking closely at the boy, everyone clearly became nervous when they realized that this boy was their target. This meant that he was much more powerful than even the ghost warriors. Then the mercenary remembered the instructions of his teacher. He asked him not to act recklessly and to weigh each order. He understood that if he survived, he had better not act so recklessly, otherwise he would die without even a chance for a happy afterlife. Immediately after these thoughts, all the comrades tensed up and began to incinerate their opponent with their gaze. Seo Juho did the same, suggesting that the guys start this fight. As a result, all four immediately rushed at the boy as their main target. They all attacked, trying to hit him with the weapons they had. However, no matter how hard they tried, Gucheon dodged every one of their pitiful attacks. At that moment, a guy in a mask attacked him, and very brazenly, straight from behind. However, the boy dodged this attack but left himself open to a blow from his female opponent. However, the hero only grinned when she came closer. At the moment of impact, aiming to hit the girl right in the face. She was saved only by the fact that at the last moment her fat friend managed to push her away, thereby saving her life. Only then did the mercenaries realize that the guy in front of them was much stronger than they had imagined even in their worst nightmares. So, having united, they began to attack all at once, trying to drive the boy into a dead end. The masked killer masterfully divided himself into several clones and attacked the hero from all sides, trying to confuse him. Apparently, Gucheon immediately recognized the familiar technique of the shadow strike. However, he knew that the opponents had no idea that this attack was completely useless against him. At that moment, the enemy approached him from behind, trying to attack, but the panicked Hone immediately helped the hero defend himself. Apparently, the masked mercenary was amazed that some boy managed to catch his sword with his bare hands. The ghost warrior himself was enraged by the behavior of the killers who came here to play with them. After which a blue aura danced around his hands, which began to gather into some kind of weapon. This weapon was called the legendary Shining Treasure created from the mana of the Phantom Warrior. In general, the treasure is a technique that belongs only to the leader of the Fighting Union, the legendary blacksmith and his followers who forged this greatest weapon in secret. The final stage of the Phantom Assassin selection test is to be chosen by this very treasure. In other words, those it does not choose cannot become ghost warriors. And now, with this very weapon, he struck his enemy, thereby throwing him away to the nearest wall, into which he crashed with a roar. Obviously, the mercenary, who had blood pouring out of his mouth, was shocked. Where did such a weak boy suddenly get such strength from? However, the guy was clearly surprised at how a pathetic mercenary dared to insult the legendary ghosts themselves. He promised that from now on the ghosts would destroy all trash that would not follow Murim's laws. Around this time, teacher Park Jong-nam's duel continued. He was clearly exhausted. His entire body was covered with small bleeding wounds. His mentor laughed. Although he had delivered a fairly powerful blow, Park Jong-nam still managed to block it. Perhaps he finally remembered the times when he was a great sword. But the old man was not surprised by his strength. After all, even if his student did not have internal energy, he was still very skilled, which is why he became his protege. At that moment, looking at the teacher with a clouded gaze, the man remembered his past. At that time, he was training in Cheonam, and his instructor constantly beat him for performing the technique incorrectly. Sometimes the boy didn't even understand what he had done wrong, and the teacher only hit him even harder. But then he explained that the main thing in strength is basic skills. He recommended that the student hone the basics of sword art. As is known, everyone develops their own habits, even if they are harmful. However, real masters who have reached the top can turn any habit into their own fighting style. In other words, until the boy reaches such a level, or until he begins his training, he needs to completely get rid of these habits and conscientiously study the basics. So the mentor immediately shouted, ordering his idiot student to forget about his hesitant stance and grab the sword once more. However, remembering this, Park Chan-nam realized that he had completely forgotten about his previous level. However, he did not understand whether the teacher was doing the right thing, that he was now instructing him, although he was his enemy. After all, the man's instructions were only a plus for him. But the old man only laughed. realizing that even if Pak Chonam really understood his words, it would not change the outcome of the battle. He was just tired of being embarrassed because Park Jongnam was still called his student. The guy was clearly irritated by this arrogant old man. However, due to his talent, Jongnam could not get rid of him at all. After all, this man's skills were literally exceptionally good, and his methods of teaching students were too. Looking at the teacher, Park Chonam remembered that when he was younger, he still learned a few things. The ghost warrior had already moved behind the mentor. He immediately summoned his legendary weapon, trying to hit the old man with a blow straight to the head. However, the grandfather smiled until the very end, as if he was pretending not to notice the attack rushing towards him. Looking at Doen, who came running to help, Park Jongnam also remembered his past. Back then, this boy was his student. He couldn't do anything, so he ran away to cry and beat himself up for his worthlessness. And every time Park Chonam came to him, who intuitively knew where to look for the boy, he came to help and comfort the child who was left all alone. The moment the memories left Park Jongnam's head, he noticed that the elder had already blocked Doen's attack. Even Dune himself was clearly surprised that some old man managed to block this blow. After this, the grandfather went into battle, giving the boy strong blows. He stopped for a moment because the boy's face seemed familiar to him. He realized that he was also a member of the Chonam clan. Only then did the old man realize that the boy was holding the legendary treasure used by the ghosts. The man found it painfully funny that Doen had left Jonam only to become one of the ghosts. The guy didn't respond to his caustic words, he just frowned with obvious hostility. Looking at the boy, it even seemed to the old man that he had not yet completed his adolescence, since he was behaving so childishly. In any case, it wasn't particularly important. The grandfather wanted to test what his own student's protege was capable of. For some reason, this made Doen extremely angry. So he immediately pounced on the enemy, gifting him with a powerful attack from the legendary weapon. The old man only grinned and laughed, seeing how the boy was filled with furious rage. He remembered how sweet Doen had been as a child, constantly suffering from his losses. As a result, becoming even more enraged, the young man continued the clearly unequal fight, and his grandfather only made fun of him. He was clearly amused that the boy was so arrogant, just like his own mentor. However, the moment the old man tried to dodge the boy's blow, he noticed that his sword had disappeared. All this time, it was just an illusion. Even though he managed to dodge intuitively, Doen's blade still cut off a decent strand of his gray hair. At this moment, for the first time in the fight, grandfather had to take a serious step back. After a short silence, he realized that Doen had long since surpassed his teacher. Of all the ghosts he had met, none had used treasures in this way. It was quite an impressive technique, for which the guy could be praised. However, the old man saw that the use of this technique put a lot of strain on the young man's body, causing him to get tired. Apparently, the reason was that the boy was using a power that he had not yet fully mastered. It was unlikely that he would be able to defeat the enemy, considering that his grandfather was a person who had reached the transformation realm. The Phantom Killer was too obviously trying to keep him at bay. Surely all this was so that Doyen would want to protect Park Jongnam, at least for a little while. However, the old man quickly realized how similar the two were in their weak character. Thus, he considered the student to be too pitiful a person. It was only then that Park Jongnam realized that all this time, even during the battle, when Do-young needed to concentrate, he was worried and trying to protect him. And all this time, he was just holding himself back, which was not worth doing. At this point, he turned to the student, asking him to retreat. But he rudely insisted that there was no need to worry about him. After all, he had learned the lessons that Park Chonam had taught him well. The man remembered their conversation that took place under that tree. The boy cried and kept apologizing to the teacher for his failure. However, he only calmly reminded that it was not proper for a man to cry over just one lost fight. As it turned out, Doen was upset. He thought he had almost won. If he had been calm and had not rejoiced ahead of time, he would have definitely won today. But the teacher only laughed at the little student, asking him not to suffer because of such nonsense. Moreover, he believed that this defeat would serve as an excellent lesson for him for the future. He must always and in any situation control his emotions and not lose his composure. This is exactly how Doen grew up into a real phantom killer. Now he fought to protect his teacher, not out of weakness or for show. For the phantom assassins are those who uphold justice as the shield of Murim and punish evil. Phantom killers exist to do justice and protect people from danger. And if it is difficult for a ghost to protect someone in battle, it means that he is not yet strong enough. Besides, he was clearly offended that the teacher was so confident that he would lose. Events returned to the hero in the school gym. There he and Hone fought against a gang of hired killers. At some point, the mercenary girl even thought that it would be better for them to run away than to say goodbye to their own lives. Even the fat man started yelling at Seo Juho, demanding that he come up with something. At that moment, the commander threw the Great Soul Capsule into their hands. Everyone knew this name well, so they were horrified. The Great Soul gave out enormous internal energy, but if its power was not controlled, a divergence in the chi energy would begin. That's why they thought Xiao Juho was crazy for suggesting such a solution. However, he quickly threw the pill into his mouth and bit into it, realizing that there was nowhere to retreat. At that very moment, energy enveloped his entire body with furious force, bursting out. Ho Yeon panicked, not understanding what this mercenary ate, while Gucheon realized what an idiot he was. The moment Xiao Juho absorbed the energy, his body began to literally pulsate with colossal internal power. The remaining mercenaries realized that in this battle they would either die or be captured and tortured for information. So they also had to swallow the pills in order to have even a small chance of winning. Now that they had all taken the medicine, the picture looked even more frightening. Even the mercenaries themselves, feeling their power, understood that the balance of power had now clearly changed. The masked mercenary charged straight at Gucheon with his blade. However, the young man managed to stop him at the last moment. But Hoen panicked. He couldn't even follow the movements of this degenerate with his eyes. At that moment, the masked man, looking at the enemy's tense face, promised that today he would definitely finish him off here and now. After which, he immediately began to attack furiously, trying to drive the hero into a dead end closer to the wall. Gucheon couldn't help but admit that these degenerates weren't that bad after all. But he didn't understand why he felt some kind of ominous fighting spirit outside the school gym. The mercenary seemed to notice that Gucheon managed to worry about something else during the fight. So, sneaking up from behind, he furiously attacked the boy, causing him to fly straight into the wall. Hearing the loud explosion, even Yu Sung panicked, not imagining what could have happened to Genjin after this attack. After which he looked back at the enemies, because he saw that their movements had reached a completely different level. At some point at this point, Gucheon was sitting on the floor, completely covered in his own blood, and ordered the scroll to show itself so that it would help him at least this time. After all, with his strength, this was obviously not a problem. He hoped that he would have better luck than with a reward like healing herbs. Indeed, the scroll that appeared before him offered him a reward in the form of a basic weapon. It immediately appeared next to Gucheon. However, even this reward seemed more like a joke. But still, using this moment, he focused on his feelings, realizing that behind the school gym there was a really dangerous guy waiting for them. It seemed like this man was at the highest level. But the more he concentrated, the more he realized that this man was even more powerful than he suspected. Around this time, Doen attacked the old man using the 36 Heavenly Swords attack. But the hero understood perfectly well that no one would ever be able to stand up to the one who was outside in a fair fight. And indeed, when the old man responded to the boy with a counterattack, his attack reached the boy's body. Looking at Doen's bloody body, the grandfather only calmly explained that his own pride had let him down. But he could still show respect for the talent he had achieved at his age. But since he hit the boy with his energy, he should have died instantly. However, Park Jungnam was furious to see how this scoundrel dared to raise his hand against his student. But the teacher only looked at the man with displeasure, and also struck him with an attack from his sword. At that moment, Gucheon realized that his teacher and the phantom assassin were probably fighting against that master outside. And if they still hadn't come to his aid, then something had happened to them. Which meant he urgently needed to deal with that old man outside and the whole pack that was rushing at him. Now his main goal was to deal with these guys without using his hidden power. So he hoped that Park Jungnam and Do-young would hold out as long as they could. What a shock it was for the old man when, even after the attack, Doen was still standing on his feet, making it clear that he would not let his grandfather go without a fight. He was truly surprised to see the young man's half-dead but determined look. It was only then that he realized that the boy was stronger than expected, considering that he had been hit with full force. At that moment, Gucheon, facing death, decided to ask his opponents why they were so clinging to him. He was clearly fed up with their persistence. These words even enraged the mercenaries a little. Seo Juho himself, while attacking, was amazed that the guy, who was to blame for his own fate, pretended as if he didn't suspect anything. Approaching Gucheon, he activated the Nightflower Deception technique right in front of his face. The commander remembered how he came to the surviving boy from the 7th team. Then he explained that the one who attacked them that night was not the Phantom Killer, but Park Jungnam's student. That's why Seo Juho came to take revenge on the guy who turned his brother into a real cripple. He remembered how, as a child, everyone had bullied his younger brother, considering them to be just orphaned idiots, nothing more. But the elder one consoled the baby every time and, holding back the pain, promised that he would protect him. When the boy grew older, he told his older brother that he would go to the dark department. He did not accept any arguments. Apparently he tried to argue with him, but the younger one was determined, and so Juho had no choice but to keep an eye on him. Now he realized that he should never have trusted his brother to such a shitty 7th team. Sending him there was a big mistake. but he still came to the director himself and asked to take the guy into the 7th team, promising that he himself would try even harder in exchange for the director listening to his words. But soon this led to him coming to the hospital and finding his brother without an arm. He blamed himself first and foremost, because he should have tried even harder to allow the younger one to live a normal life under his supervision. He blamed himself very much for letting him out from under his wing, and for him being left without an arm. While he was furious, the commander dealt the hero powerful attacks and was sure that he had definitely hit him. However, to his shock, when he turned around, he did not see Gucheon either next to him or behind him. It turns out that the guy got away from all the attacks in time and appeared at the moment when the enemy finally lost his vigilance. He ended up giving So Juho a powerful attack and severing his right hand, which was holding his blade. He also calmly explained to the naive boy that everyone who joined the world of martial arts has their own tragic story. Every step they take is already risking their lives. He himself had previously risked everything in order to prove his case. The only thing Seo Juho could give was not meaningless consolation, but real respect as a martial artist. After defeating the next masked mercenary, he calmly explained to them that he was following his own path. However, I saw that So Juho's sword was sincere. He trained constantly without a break, perhaps never missing a single day. But now he cannot apply the technique correctly, because this technique must be free in order to prove its true value. After which he decided to show So Juho the correct execution of the Night Flower Deception technique, to make sure that the technique would be thoroughly imprinted in his memory. Because compared to his unwavering honesty, deception and a deadly blow will always prevail. Apparently, the last thing Seo Juho saw was Gucheon approaching and his imminent death. He couldn't believe that someone had managed to use a strike that he had spent years honing. But in the end, the guy perfectly executed that same Night Flower Deception, and the enemy's entire body was cut into tiny pieces. The last thing that popped into his head was a memory with his younger brother, when he comforted him and protected him from all sorts of bullies. All the other mercenaries were speechless at what they saw, not believing that the commander had just died. The fat man began to look around, not understanding where the old man, the strongest of them, had gone. At that moment, Gucheon was already bleeding, realizing that he had clearly overdone it with the use of force. He didn't even notice how the old man approached him, who clearly appreciated the rather interesting skills of the young enemy. In fact, the grandfather had been watching the battle that the hero was waging against the commander for a long time. He was even glad that they had finally finished their fight and he would be able to join it. After all, the old man, who had already dealt with the student and Doen, wanted to have some fun. The moment his grandfather approached him, Gucheon instinctively jumped back, realizing that this was the man who had been outside the whole time. The old man looked at the kid appraisingly, amazed that he had seen the skill only once, but had already managed to repeat it. Only then did a frightened Hoyoung join Gucheon. They both realized that the old man had been watching their fight the entire time. The hero was clearly offended that this guy dared to hide from his sight, and so brazenly peeked right under his nose. Hon was more interested in whether the phantom killer who was outside was alive. But the old man only said with a smile that of all those who stood in his way, not a single one survived. This was the answer to the girl's question. At that moment, the hero calmly thanked Hoenn, who had fought quite well, even though he was a loser. Apparently, the guy was furious that Gucheon continued to humiliate him in such a situation. But she tried to come to her senses, realizing that she needed to put all her worries aside and focus on the battle. So I just asked Gucheon to join forces in order to win this fight. However, the guy shouldn't have said it out loud, because everything was obvious from the very beginning. At that moment, 2 surviving mercenaries appeared behind the old man. They were clearly unhappy that Grandpa was so late because of the children's games. They really almost died, because the fight was dangerous, and they warned that this kid is stronger than he looks. He killed not only Seo Juho, but also the masked boy. So the old man had no choice but to ask the frightened mercenaries to stand aside and simply watch the excellent fight. He wanted them to stay out of it until the very end, no matter what happened. So these 2 guys got into position, ready to fight a real martial artist. The rest of the mercenaries were amazed by the stubbornness of this old man, who did not understand how strong an opponent he was fighting. The grandfather himself, repelling the attacks of his opponents, understood that these were clearly not all the skills that Gucheon could show him. He really wanted the guy to show him his true strength. The hero understood perfectly well that in order to bring down this old man, he really needed to use the power from his past life. However, if he used it, he would put everyone around him in danger, considering that his grandfather wouldn't just stand there and wait for him to strike. He needed some kind of strong, fast move that wouldn't destroy his body. At that moment, noticing the hero's thoughtfulness, the old man pounced on him. However, Hoenn protected his comrade in time, throwing his grandfather away. He was furious at his impudent behavior and wanted to finish him off right there and then. The old man was only amused by the boy's decisive words. However, I suddenly saw the stance he had taken and finally realized why the guy had been speaking with an accent all this time. From his fighting style, it was obvious that he was from Shaolin. Even Guxian was surprised to hear these words. But Hone calmly explained that Shaolin was a thing of the past. Now he was a member of the Union and a phantom assassin. The old man laughed loudly. He liked the way things were unfolding. That's why he enjoyed fighting the phantom assassins. Usually all Korean martial artists were from Jeonnam, and fighting them was a real bore. Even the hero admitted that his comrade seemed more and more interesting with each new fact, but they both decided to chat a little later, and first kill this idiot. At that moment, Hoenn resolutely suggested to Guqian that he use his power, and the old man stood there letting them exchange a few words in order to at least slightly decide on tactics. But very quickly the break ended, and the grandfather prepared to attack to see what the kids had prepared for him. He first targeted the Shaolin master, who was fighting off his attacks. Just when it seemed like grandfather's sword was about to hit the enemy's body straight, it suddenly didn't leave the slightest scratch. And all because the guy from Shaolin knew how to use the diamond body technique. But even so, the old man was interested in how strong this technique would be and how many blows it could withstand. As Hoenn fought off the endless attacks, he realized that his opponent was truly crazy. However, the guy had to hold out as long as possible in order to give the hero at least a little time. He poured more and more internal energy into his blade so that it would not split under the onslaught of endless attacks. However, the next moment the blade shattered into pieces and his body was struck by a sword strike. The old man just laughed, realizing that he had won this time after all. At that moment, Gucheon watched from the side and finally understood what was going on. So he immediately threw Hoenn away so that he wouldn't be attacked by this madman again. At that moment he activated his hidden power, which pierced only one old man. Even he couldn't dodge that attack when he was distracted. It was a blow designed for one purpose only. The hero remembered the decisive pose of his opponent and took exactly the same stance, trying to repeat the blow. Even the mercenaries and the phantom assassin opened their mouths wide when they saw the blow coming towards the old man. Gucheon was furious that he had to use this technique. Just thinking about this strike made him furious. In addition, he felt his body was too tense due to the fact that he had released an excessive amount of energy. However, at that moment the system began to shower him with messages, surrounding him from all sides. The mercenaries didn't know what to do. Everything indicated that the boy had managed to hit the old man, even though he had used up all his strength. This meant that it was now their turn to finish off the hero. But the old man only became furious, rudely reminding his subordinates that he had ordered them not to interfere no matter what. Hearing his voice, Gucheon panicked, realizing that this crazy old man had managed to survive. At that moment, he was already rushing towards the boy. Only at the last moment did the hero manage to grab his blade with his own hands. At this point, the old man's clothes and body were covered in blood. He praised the boy. He could be proud of himself because he made him give it his all. Only then did the mercenaries realize that the old man had drawn his legendary third sword, something he had not done for a very long time. He laughed as he explained to the boy that no one had ever survived after seeing this sword, after which he attacked, and a strong explosion occurred at the site of his attack. Only then was the grandfather able to breathe a sigh of relief, realizing that he really had almost died this time. However, he suddenly saw a blade that appeared in the ground as if out of nowhere. He decided to pull it out, but realized that it was not moving at all. After which he felt something strange, some kind of evil energy as if weaving into his body. He felt such horror that even his body trembled. At that moment, the hero was standing nearby, trying to catch his breath after the attack. The system gave him the skill Wanderer's Sword, a nameless sword that serves only the beast. Its first effect controls the user's internal energy and greatly increases attack power. And now the boy was holding this sword in his hands, and the old man was panicking, not understanding how he had survived even after the attack. It turned out that the moment his grandfather attacked, the hero woke up in his former body as a heavenly demon in some unknown white space. Apparently the guy was scared, thinking that he had died again. He began to curse his old body again. If he were real, he would have killed this old man with one blow. However, I suddenly heard some noise nearby. At that moment he saw a swordsman passing by him. He immediately remembered Sojuho's silhouette and pounced on the swordsman, trying to attack him. He believed that it was his doing that he ended up in this place, and he intended to rip his head off. But at that moment, the silhouette hissed something like a broken doll, and then fell silent. Gucheon only became more enraged, not understanding what was going on and what kind of nonsense this man was talking about. But at that very moment, he began to be sucked into an incomprehensible space. So he woke up safe and sound in the modern world, and in his hands was already a blade shining with a bright purple light. The old man, looking at this weapon, realized that it was a sword that even he could not touch. The grandfather honestly admitted that the boy's first weapon was not good enough. He even felt sorry that he had to get out his third blade. However, now he was ready to cross blades with the guy, because he saw his weapon, worthy of meeting with his sword. At that moment, the hero himself did not understand what he was holding in his hands. He didn't know what the man who sent him here had decided to come up with this time, or what kind of blade it was. But he felt that with this sword, he would be able to use his technique to the fullest. Without thinking about anything else, he decided to kill this annoying old man first. In an instant, he rushed towards him and pointed his blade straight at the idiot's neck. Only then did the mercenaries realize that after the hero had taken that serious blow, he had somehow woken up and stood on the same level as the old man. Even the grandfather realized that this boy had a high level, perhaps even higher than his. And so the unequal battle continued. And at this point, Gushan was already pressing his enemy. He felt that the boy's strength had become much stronger thanks to his new blade. However, he still had to show this kid that it was better not to get into trouble with him. As the two exchanged blows, sparks flew from everywhere, burning the bodies of nearby enemies. Hone understood this too, so he immediately erected a protective barrier around the school children, who were still sleeping peacefully on the ground. As the battle continued, the mercenaries noticed that even the formation of the golden chain began to tremble from the force of the fight. Everything that was happening now was clearly too dangerous. The old man himself understood that during all these clashes, his blade had never pierced the young man's body. But despite this, for some reason he continued to cough up blood. Perhaps he simply wasn't strong enough to handle his energy. In any case, for the old mercenary, it was a chance to win. The grandfather honestly admitted that he really wanted to hit the boy again, using all his strength for this. But he saw that soon the boy would become the one who could surpass him. Unfortunately, that day is still far away. It is unlikely that he will live to see it. Now the young man was not strong enough to win. So the old man decided to finish him off painlessly as a sign of respect for the strength he had gained. And so the secret heart technique of the heavenly companion sword, the wandering snake of the Shadow King, rushed towards the boy. However, Genjin, looking at the technique, was not at all afraid. He understood that he was completely different from the image the old man had imagined in his head. He had already obtained absolute power once in his life, and he never hesitated to obtain it. He always robbed and killed if necessary. This is how he achieved this power in very dishonest ways, which the old man never even dreamed of. He never relied on luck or anything else, putting everything on the line and continuing to fight. Thanks to this, he became strong enough to strike down the old man, who could hardly defend himself from his enraged power. Even Hone's shield began to fail from the force of the blow. It seemed like both of them had completely gone mad, exchanging such blows. However, to his great surprise, when the smoke cleared, the hero was already lying on the ground, while the old man was still standing on his feet. The mercenaries were obviously happy that their grandfather had won and that they had completed their mission successfully. And the old man himself only spat blood with displeasure, looking at his defeated enemy. At that moment, the boy remembered how the phantom assassins came to him to discuss the construction of the golden chain. It was originally a formation that locked the enemy through 8 gates, a secret technique of the clan. They stole it, changed it to suit their style, and even Park Chanam couldn't help but be irritated by such dirty tricks. However, he did not understand how the construction of the golden chain had been changed and how it could be launched. It turns out that the person who starts the formation must do it consciously or directly, and only the one who started it can freely enter and exit. Everyone present had a natural question. How did Gushan manage to break through the formation? In any case, one thing was clear. To escape from captivity, it was necessary to defeat the one who activated it. As it turned out, the opponents decided to use additional equipment, a special talisman that strengthened the structure even more. As a result, the structure could exist regardless of who launched it, and such magical talismans are capable of disguising themselves as any objects. However, they did not prepare such devices in the last battles. Besides, they would hardly hide such artifacts everywhere. If they were accidentally discovered, the formation would be disrupted. Therefore, it was assumed that, for greater reliability, mercenaries keep such devices on themselves. That's why the guy, using his last strength, led the old man into a dead end and attacked the girl's ear with a strange earring on it. The mercenaries immediately became alarmed, not understanding how the boy managed to find the device. One of them shouted, demanding that the old man kill this boy immediately, otherwise the ghosts would arrive soon. However, before he could finish speaking, the phantom assassins had already burst into the formation. Gucheon just chuckled, knowing that with his injured body, this was the best he could do. Now it was the turn of the party in which Damro was supposed to work. Therefore, he immediately ordered his soldiers to disperse, and ordered some to check the civilians. Only then did the old man realize that these kids had managed to outplay him after all. The next moment, one of the subordinates ran up to Phantom Assassin Hoenn, praising him for his excellent work. After which he looked at the old man, warning that if he moved even a millimeter, he would die. Soon, the ghost assassins stationed everywhere reported that the area had been cleared. All civilians were also fine. However, unfortunately, Phantom Killer Do Young and Park Jungnam were now in critical condition. Apparently, Damro was surprised that none of the mercenaries even touched the civilians. It seemed to him that perhaps these guys had at least a little conscience left. At that moment, he heard the loud cries of the mercenaries, who blamed the old man for everything. But he didn't seem to be at all sad. He just calmly summed up that his fun had ended there. Of course, Damro was furious that the mercenaries did something like this just for their own amusement. But the old man, leaving, only laughed at his words, explaining that this was really the only reason, to amuse the old man in his declining years. Another plus was that he was promised good pay for such an easy mission. Then, looking at this man, Damro was convinced that he was and remained the same scoundrel as in the past. At that moment, one of the younger phantom assassins ran up to the master, worriedly reporting that they couldn't find Suyeon. He was very worried that something might happen to the girl. It was only then that Hoen realized that the new guy clearly didn't know how strong Suyeon was. Just at that moment, she called Damro to report that she had completed her mission. And all because among all the phantom assassins in the fight, she was the strongest in battle. At this point, Damro ordered his subordinates to clean up the place as quickly as possible, and once again thoroughly check the civilians to bring them to their senses. But everyone suddenly felt some strange power erupting from Gucheon's body, so they immediately ran up to him to help the boy come to his senses. But they couldn't do anything, because under his pressure the wounds began to bleed more intensely. Seeing Hoen suffering, Gucheon advised them to leave as soon as possible and not worry about anything. However, Damro did not leave him alone. He immediately ran up to save the boy. Grabbing his hand, he ordered him not to let go under any circumstances, which frightened the youngest fighter quite a bit. However, Damro simply could not allow anyone else to be hurt. As a result, the two were sucked into some unknown space together, and a small explosion occurred at the place where they disappeared. Apparently, the phantom assassin standing nearby froze in fear, not understanding what had happened to the master. Soon they found themselves together in a room lit by Chinese lanterns. Gucheon, looking at the scroll shining in front of him, could not believe that what happened was real. But Damro, who had moved with him, had no idea what had happened or where they had ended up. After which he looked at the boy with concern, trying to understand if everything was okay with him. In fact, a couple of seconds ago the guy was just lying down, resting after a hard fight. The next moment a scroll appeared in front of him. However, the young man already understood what his reward was. He just wanted to take a break, but unfortunately, when he tried to close the window, he automatically began to move straight to the demon's lair. He didn't want to move there now, but Mr. Damro also joined him. The gentleman himself understood that they had teleported, because everything around him did not particularly resemble an illusion. After which he looked at the hero, suspecting that this was his work. On the contrary, he was delighted that the boy had mastered the technique of compressing the earth. But judging by his reaction, it became obvious that he had no idea what it was. So he demanded an explanation from the guy about what had happened, because he had the feeling that everything that was happening to him was some kind of dream. Whatever it was, all he wanted was to get back as soon as possible. In any case, they needed to quickly clean up the school and interrogate the enemies. However, looking at Gucheon's reaction, he guessed that the boy was not going to return them. So he reminded them that they had a lot of work to do that he couldn't ignore. However, Gucheon, completely ignoring his words, walked further into the lair of the heavenly demon. He calmly explained that there was only one way to get home quickly. So, opening the door, he asked the man to just keep quiet and follow him. And so began the first chapter, a solo battle. The test was 999 challenge, 9. Looking at what was happening around him, Damro realized how unpredictable Gucheon was. However, he believed the boy and that he would still keep his word. Besides, he wanted to repay his debt for all the boy's efforts in catching the villains, whom he himself could not reach. Eventually, they both entered the demon's lair and the test began. It was supposed to help the hero become stronger. So in this test, these two rushed across the battlefield, destroying their enemies. Gucheon fought like a madman, mercilessly destroying the zombies that dared to approach him. Even Damro seemed a little taken aback by the boy's excessive cruelty. Besides, he saw that he was feeling great, although he was willing to bet that Gucheon had serious wounds from the battle before entering here. He wanted to know what happened, and why he was acting as if he was safe and sound. Gucheon was very surprised that Damro didn't notice anything when he arrived here. Then he explained that this space healed all wounds, even if they were fatal. It was precisely for this reason that he was covered in blood, but there were no wounds on him. At that moment, while fighting with his opponents, Gucheon noticed that their level had increased. They had become much faster and more agile. But even so, they were absolutely no match for the guy. However, in this battle he lost his arm, which immediately began to heal back. But it looked very scary, considering that despite the wounds healing, Gucheon endured all this pain with a smile. So a couple of hours passed before they defeated all the monsters rushing towards them. Gucheon was overjoyed, realizing that the battle with 99 zombies was finally over. As a reward, the scroll offered to receive 30 years of internal energy. and then a pill appeared in his hands, which the guy wanted to swallow with a smile. But at that moment, the system offered him to complete the final battle. And then, right next to them, a huge bloody red explosion of energy occurred. Then a monster appeared in front of them that looked stronger than anyone they had fought before. When he simply roared, he threw away all the dead bodies that were lying around him. And it became clear to the hero that if he killed this beast, then he would certainly return home. So he charged at the monster, ready to kill it here and now. But no matter how he hit, he realized that his body was protected by diamond armor, the same one that Hone used in the fight with the old man. And the level of this monster itself was radically different from those he had seen before. At that moment, the monster, enraged, attacked the boy, who, due to fatigue, could not move an inch from the attack. But fortunately, Damro arrived in time and, with the help of his weapon, managed to put up a block that prevented the monster from passing. Guqian was well aware that the external healing of his wounds was not stopping. However, the internal injuries from all the battles he had experienced were quite serious. Even Damro was amazed at how patient the boy was with the pain he was experiencing, so out of respect he offered to deal with the beast himself. It was at that very moment that the monster roared loudly and began to break through the barrier erected by Mr. Damro. The man himself continued to look at the hero, who clearly did not want to accept anyone's help. His feelings were absolutely clear to the master. After all, he too felt something similar when he encountered those whom he himself could not overcome. So the man dropped to one knee in front of the boy and decided to find out if he would give him a chance to repay him for his help. The hero only smiled, realizing that the gentleman was trying to calm him down somehow. It must be admitted that Damro really had the gift of the gab. Eventually, under his piercing gaze, the boy gave in and allowed Damro to deal with everything himself. And then the satisfied man grabbed his blade and rushed into battle against the monster, in order to show him where his real enemy was. In an instant, he cut off the monster's hand, causing it to scream loudly. And then, with his holy weapon, he began to tear his body into small pieces. He defeated the monster, who had no idea how powerful the real phantom killers were. After the monster behind him was blown to pieces, the gentleman happily thought that they could now return home. A notification from the scroll appeared before the hero, congratulating him on the end of the final battle and offering to take a special reward. This reward was entry into the second chapter. Apparently, Damro was a little dissatisfied because Guqian said that after passing this test, they would be able to return home. However, the boy himself did not expect that everything would turn out this way. He himself was dissatisfied. They found themselves in a completely dark space and it was unclear where to go. As a result, not knowing what to do, the two wandered through an unknown space for what seemed like more than an hour. However, there was not even a glimmer of light ahead. It was unclear what this test was aimed at and what they needed to do to complete it. However, at that moment the boy stopped, which surprised the gentleman quite a bit. As it turned out, at that moment he finally began to see something in this emptiness, but he did not understand what it was. He saw a burning house and many children running away from it screaming, after which he saw some children attack the boy, accusing him of starting the fire, and he argued that it wasn't him. This little boy was Guqian in his childhood days who constantly suffered such humiliation. Very soon after beating him, those children left, and he was left alone lying on the ground and still crying because of the injustice. After all, he was punished for literally nothing. However, at that moment he heard someone calling his name, so he calmly turned around and saw his friends beckoning him to them. They were the elders he was friends with. Moreover, there was a leader among them who did not understand why the boy was so late, and obviously the hero immediately rushed towards them. His appearance finally became the same as it was in his real life, and now he was again, as before, sitting with his mentor and drinking tea. The leader of the demonic cult saw that the boy was very tired after the hunt, so he suggested that he go and rest. However, the hero refused because he wanted to stay with the leader longer today. Apparently, hearing such words, the man thought that his ward had done something wrong, and when the hero began to awkwardly justify himself, he only laughed, explaining that he said it only for the sake of a joke. After all, he himself was not against enjoying today. Apparently, the guy was very pleased to sit in this company. However, deep inside he had a feeling that he had forgotten something, but he didn't care. Even though in this test he was literally drowning in memories and slowly dying without realizing it. At this time, a dialogue was taking place between the head of the dark department and something else. A gentleman came to him, very unhappy that they had suffered colossal losses after the failed mission. Besides, it seemed to him that they could not just throw away valuable specimens like that old man. However, the man calmly explained that the leader of the Phantom Assassins had disappeared. It seemed to him quite profitable to exchange the old man as a pawn for him. However, at that moment the man grabbed the old man's subordinate using telekinesis, after which he looked at him angrily, reminding him that they had met to discuss harm or benefit. They had to be as sure as possible that Damro had definitely disappeared and would not return. The old man became very tense as he saw his opponent using Void Grasp, a technique in which an internal energy master moves objects using chi. The gentleman himself, hidden in the shadows, honestly admitted that it was very difficult for him to trust the words of the head of the Dark Department. However, he explained with a smile that he could vouch for the words of his people, who had already confirmed Damro's disappearance. But even so, it seemed too strange to the man that someone like the leader of the Phantom Assassins would disappear without a trace in literally a second. But the head of the Dark Department reassured the guest, explaining that their special team was investigating the incident and there was nothing to worry about. So he suggested that they discuss the secret treasure that had been talked about shortly before. The unknown guest sat alone with the views, enjoying the city lights. However, his subordinate suddenly arrived and noticed that the gentleman was sitting alone and sad, after which she brought him his robe, explaining that an important person was looking for him. Apparently, immediately after this, the guy pulled on his cape and hurried away. But finally, looking at the shining city, he promised that very soon he would turn this whole rainbow place into hell. At this time, the hero continued to live his former happy life. At that moment, he was in an inn where a local rich man was enjoying his drink, delighted at how delicious it was. After which he ordered the owner of the establishment to immediately pour them more wine. However, unfortunately, at that moment the bottle that the waiter was pouring suddenly became empty. Enraged, he immediately threw it towards the waitress, not understanding how they had allowed this to happen. At this point, the innkeeper immediately demanded that the girls hurry up and bring more drinks and food. However, they awkwardly explained to the gentleman that all the prepared dishes were finished, and the porters from the hotel were in no hurry to bring food here today. The lodger was very disappointed that they had no more food or drink. But at that moment, another waitress arrived and offered him an elite expensive liqueur. It was truly a rare thing, which made the man immediately start licking his lips. The waiters told him how hard it was to get it, so they promised that they would bring him food very soon. However, suddenly the hero came up and finally realized where the drinks had been hidden from him. The frightened waitresses tried to explain that they had already served the gentleman 20 bottles. There was only one left today for another guest. But he, completely ignoring their words, snatched the bottle and began to drain it straight from the neck. The guest who saw this began to cry with anger because there was only one bottle of liqueur for him. After which he got angry at this scoundrel and destroyed the table at which he was sitting. And then, together with his guys, he attacked the heavenly demon, wanting to tear him into tiny pieces. The hero just sighed awkwardly, realizing that this would not end well for them. Finally, when the wine was delivered to the establishment, they saw a real pogrom. The leader of the sect, who was also a guest, did not understand why the young man, even knowing him personally, still made such a scene. However, the hero was not interested in such individuals who had betrayed the demonic cult. Therefore, he instantly killed this fat old man. Soon, when the guy finished his massacre, realizing that he was too drunk, he decided to return home. But he noticed a scene in broad daylight when some boys were torturing some boy and trying to take away the bag that was in his hands. Finally, throwing him aside, the robbers saw that his bag was completely filled with wine, for which they could get a lot of money. The frightened guy immediately crawled towards them, trying to take his goods back. However, the bandit only hit him harder in the face, after which they began to kick the unfortunate man. They did not understand where this fool came from, who walked around in broad daylight and shone with his goodness. But the boy only asked for mercy, because if he did not deliver the goods to their destination, they would simply kill him. But it seemed that this did not bother the small bandits at all, who only laughed at the fate of this poor fellow. Suddenly a hero approached these guys from behind. Without even turning around, the guys immediately felt the ominous smell of blood coming from this man. The bandits immediately became frightened at the mere sight of the hero, and ran away screaming, even forgetting that they wanted to steal bottles of wine. The hero himself indifferently opened one of the bottles and immediately realized by the smell that this young man was delivering wine for one of the taverns nearby. After which he immediately drained the bottle to the bottom. However, looking at the guy's frightened look, he explained that it would be better for him to tell the hotel that he had already delivered the wine personally to the man in red, since he had already paid for it. However, before leaving, he looked back at the boy, realizing that he should at least try to call for help, start biting or resisting. After all, if he continues to do nothing, he will become accustomed to constantly receiving only slaps. Silence will become the norm for him, and eventually giving in will become a habit. So he ordered him to stop being stupid and start fighting. What he was currently enduring was disgusting. However, the boy sincerely did not understand what would change at all if he began to resist. If he fought, it was unlikely that his miserable life would change and become suddenly better. Still, he was lowborn and had never even touched martial arts, so it was unlikely that such a worthless person could afford to fight. From childhood, he understood that it was better for him to live a miserable life or just die. But the hero was just like this guy before, so he knew that since he had nothing to fight for, he really should just go and die.